Leonidas was easily polite, yet whenever I happened to look his way I saw his eyes on me. In part it was flattering, but in part it was also disconcerting. I'm afraid I drank a bit more wine than I normally did. Yet I could eat no more than normal with my forced small stomach. As a result, when the time came to dance I was much more exuberant than usual. Reynol leaned over during one of our breaks when Leonidas had escorted me back to our seats and loudly stated, "It seems that our princess is quite happy tonight. Perhaps she enjoys making a spectacle of herself before the castle courtyard crowd." Leonidas and I had both reached for our cups the moment we sat down, but perhaps I had taken a smaller sip, so I was the first that could react. "General Reynol," I smiled at him with even more heat than the first time we had met. "Perhaps it is just that Leonidas is man enough to awaken a woman's ardor. And perhaps it was just coincidental that Duchess Amity, seated next to Reynol as usual, had taken that moment to doze off." Leonidas spluttered into his wine, and those around tittered most satisfactorily. Reynol's face grew brighter than Julia's hair. He stood abruptly, poking at Amity. "Madam, it appears it is time for you to go to bed." "I will assist you," he growled. Julia picked up her own wineglass and pretended to murmur into it. In fact, her voice was loud enough to carry clearly. "The man for me won't need to assist me to bed. I'll be there first, anxious and ready." Reynol's back, all that we could still see, got even stiffer than his normal martial posture. He said nothing, however, merely helping the groggy Amity out of the hall. After their departure, the feast got merry. Julia danced with a dozen men, but I accepted invitations only from Leonidas. I don't think Mother even needed to pull any strings to make sure that the musicians played at least a few slower, more intimate tunes whenever Leonidas led me onto the dance floor. Still, there were enough faster melodies that we often needed our wine when we returned to our seats. As the evening wore on, I realized I was getting even less inhibited. Finally, after an extended giggling session where everything anyone did seemed hilariously funny, Leonidas stood and offered his arm to me. "My princess, I think you need some fresh air." "My prince, that is not all that I need." I clung to his arm with more need than I had expected as he led me from the hall. Our path to our balcony now, led by his chambers. At the doorway, I glanced inside. "You haven't changed things much from when Tamer was here." "I suspect he and I could have been friends under other circumstances," Leonidas mused as he followed me into his room. The few steps away from Leonidas had reminded me of how much I had had to drink. I staggered slightly, leaning on the corner post of Leonidas' bed. His arms were immediately around me to steady me. "Do I really awaken a woman's ardor?" he breathed into my ear. My answer was my lips, given without words. He took them as his own. His hands explored the smooth, sleek curves revealed by my so seductive gown. I leaned into his body, forming my own to his in a more ancient dance than any played by the musicians. I felt with a distant part of my mind as his hand began to undo the lacing that held my dress, but it was unimportant. Nothing was important but the warmth of his lips on mine, the hardness that had made its presence so obvious between us. For all that the gown fit me like a shiny skin above the skirts, yet those skirts started low enough that my hips had expanded. When Leonidas had released the laces, my dress would have slipped to the floor unimpeded, but for the petticoats that gave such elegant fullness. These Leonidas also released, but it was the loss of their weight that finally intruded into my distracted passion. I stepped back from Leonidas in just my chemise, trying to get my drink-clumsied legs free of all those acres of fabric, and fell sprawling, my chemise flying up to reveal what little it had concealed. Or perhaps the very great secret it had concealed, for the gown itself left little to imagine about my form. Yet with my chemise up around my armpits, Leonidas could now see the maiden's lover that had been hidden behind the fabric. "What is that thing you wear?" he asked as he helped me to my feet. I just tried to pull the thin material of my chemise down to conceal once again my hidden tormentor. My shock and dismay and embarrassment and whatever coupled with my drunkenness to give me the hiccups. If there were anything more that could be done to make me feel terrible, I couldn't imagine what it would be. So I did what seemed to be my only logical action. I started to cry. My sobs reinforced my hiccups and my embarrassment grew further. Leonidas tried to comfort me, but I was too distressed for his embrace and turned away, waving my arm behind me to make him keep his distance. He didn't. Instead, I felt his strong arms around my waist as I turned to the wall. To his credit, he just held me, not using the opportunity to explore further the diabolical device that I had never hated so much in my life. "What is this thing?" he asked again, though softly, uncritically. "It's called a maiden's lover," I explained between sobs. "And hiccups. Its purpose is to make sure that my virtue remains intact, even if my own heart is not strong enough." "Who makes you wear such a thing?" he asked in amazement. "Mother, but it is our custom. Julia has her own." In our tradition, the mother of a bride gives the key to the groom's mother, who then hides it somewhere in the groom's belongings. The couple must find the key before they can consummate the marriage. Some custom. And I thought we in High Canyon were often cruel. By this time my sobs were getting under control, though not my hiccups. There was so much horror in his voice that I had to giggle. "Well, it's supposed to give the bride an incentive, to be nice to her new, mother-in-law. So that she doesn't, hide the key too well, The humor was back in his eyes when he heard the humor in my voice. He turned me around and offered to solve another of my problems. "I have a cure for the hiccups, you know." "Really, "Yes," he promised with a grin. "It involves controlled breathing exercises." "Breathing, "Like this," he said, lowering his lips to mine. "I highly recommend the High Canyon cure for hiccups." Unfortunately, that was the only need for which he had an immediate cure, and it was not my most pressing need at that. Actually, with that thought I realized I did not have a pressing need. My maiden's lover was no more painful than normal. It seemed only Julia could excite passions beyond my mind. Well, and my breathing, which was controlled rather wonderfully by Leonidas. For a time that seemed very long, yet very short. Somewhere in there his hands did wander enough to determine the extent of my imprisonment. The touch of his fingers along the borders of my undesired armor sent shivers up my spine that define the extent of his effect on me as well as they define the limits of my guardian garment. It was a powerful effect, yet it was an unyielding guardian. Somewhere in there also, my hiccups vanished. I'm not sure what controls there were on my breathing, but it was definitely affected. When he finished his cure, I was breathless, but a lot more sober than I had been. I put my head on his shoulder and sighed, "I'm sorry, my prince. I should not have drunk so much tonight. It made me forget my prison in favor of my desire." I felt his head nod above me, but he said nothing. He just held me quietly. After a long moment, I kicked at the pile of clothes that I had thought to escape. Clearly, I needed to dress again. The thought of once again putting on that beautiful gown created within me a sense of conflict as great as that from kissing Leonidas after kissing Julia. Whoever I was, I now wanted to wear beautiful clothes. Clothes like those scattered about the floor of Leonidas' room. Leonidas noticed my motion, of course. He was so wonderfully attentive to me. Taking the innermost petticoat from the pile, he once again tied it about my waist. Just like a lady's maid, he helped me to dress, finally lacing the back of the gown until it fit as sleekly as when I first sortied forth from my chambers so long ago that evening. "I think I could still use some air," I murmured. "I think we could both use some air," he agreed. He grabbed a cloak from his room and we went to mine, though this time he carefully remained in the hallway when I went in. In just a moment I had a cloak and gloves of my own. We ascended to our balcony and watched the brilliance of the winter stars, glittering like chips of ice not too different from the sparkle of frost on windows in our courtyard. "The stars shine like your eyes," he offered a different comparison. I looked up to him, which was fast becoming a favorite pastime due to the predictable effect. In a heartbeat our lips were once again warming each other, though the heat that arose had more to do with rapid heartbeats than the temperature of our touching skin. I had surrendered to his control once again, letting his hands shape my posture to best advantage against his when lights and shouts interrupted us. "My Lord Regent! Your Highness! Come quickly!" "What is the matter?" we asked in unpracticed unison, equally identical tones of petulance in our voices. "General Reynol has attacked Duchess Amity. He has been caught in the act. The Regent must judge at his trial." Chapter 16. Blind Justice? The servant that had found us turned immediately back down the stairs. We followed, after a glance at each other that revealed no greater understanding in either set of eyes. The servant led us directly to the throne room, already largely populated. Queen Celie sat in her high seat with Julia in the position I often occupied. A flicker of a glance from Mother, and I stood beside Leonidas instead of displacing Julia, though I was not sure why that should be my place. While I was handing my cloak and gloves to Mina, Reynol was brought into the chamber. He appeared more disheveled than actively abused, but it was significant that all 4 of the guards that escorted him were Achaean. He also looked more confused than I could remember seeing him. Angry, suspicious, arrogant as always, but still there was that surprising note of confusion as well. Leonidas, who never sat in the king's throne except when hearing a capital case, remained standing. His first words were to his general, Reynol, "What is going on here? These fools are accusing me of something. It doesn't make any sense." Queen Celie now spoke. "He is accused of assault on my sister-in-law, the Duchess Amity." "Sexual assault?" "What?" Leonidas asked. "Preposterous," Reynol snorted simultaneously. Before either could speak again, Queen Celie continued, "My Lord Regent, in the laws of Achaea and the claimed laws of High Canyon, rape is considered a capital offense." Leonidas whirled to look at her to find a calm but determined expression on her face. Her strength of will was such that she didn't even need to glance at the king's throne to make it clear what action she expected Leonidas to take. In this case, he had no desire that Mother could reinforce with the white-cold mind, so I knew his choice would be his own. All this took only a few heartbeats, even at the accelerated pace my own was struggling to sustain. In fact, before Reynol even got past his spluttering expletives, the challenge had been made, and the resulting decision. Leonidas turned and sat in the king's throne. Now, as I took my place, it was in the position taken by a prince's intended, with Queen Celie in the role of Dowager Queen. It made it look like I was there to support Leonidas, not Mother. A glance from Leonidas and Reynol stilled his expostulations. Leonidas took on the role intended for him, but not in a way he ever intended. "Who brings these accusations?" "I will do, for now," Queen Celie proclaimed. At Leonidas' nod, she began her interrogation. "Reynol, tell us what happened when you left the dining hall." "Nothing. I took Amity to her room," he made a surly reply. "And then?" "Well, she invited me in for a drink of wine. She had been drinking too much at the feast, but she insisted that I share one last glass with her." "Did anyone else see her grace drink too much at the feast?" Queen Celie asked of the room at large. "Actually, no, Hugh," the chamberlain replied. "I was monitoring the servants as usual, and no special amount was taken to her grace." "Was she in the habit of drinking to excess?" Queen Celie now asked the chamberlain. "No, she always drank quite moderately." The queen now turned her questions back to the accused. "General Reynol, on what basis do you accuse Duchess Amity of excessive drinking?" "Well, she was nodding in her cups at the table." "You all saw that," he replied. Julia spoke up now. "All I saw was her nodding off, perhaps from boredom rather than drink." I felt as much as saw Leonidas respond to this observation with a tightening of his already tense shoulders. "Was Duchess Amity in the habit of inviting you in to drink in her rooms?" the queen continued. "No, this was the first time," admitted Reynol. "Was she in the habit of inviting you into her rooms for other reasons?" "No, this was the first time, all right." Queen Celie demonstrated her typical disregard for questions from others and continued, "Did anyone else see her invite you in?" He just shook his head no, a look of concern beginning to grow on his features. His eyes sought out those of Leonidas, but I could tell that the regent would not meet his gaze. "What happened next?" asked Queen Celie. "I don't remember," Reynol muttered. "What?" This question came from Leonidas. "I don't remember," Reynol repeated louder. Queen Celie paused to see if Leonidas had further questions. At his silence, she asked her own. "What do you remember?" "The next thing I remember is a bunch of shouting, and someone holding my arms, and this blasted headache." "Very well," the queen responded, then looked to Leonidas. "With your permission, my Lord Regent, I would like to ask questions of others who were there." At his nod, Queen Celie nodded at Hugh, who nodded in turn at a guard by a side door. From this door marched another Achaean guard and Mother's servant, Amy. "Who was the first to come upon the scene?" Queen Celie asked again of the room at large. I was, Amy replied. Tell us what you saw. I saw her grace struggling under the arms of General Reynol. He had his arms around her, but her own arms were against his chest. At the queen's nod, she continued. Her grace's clothes were, all torn. Her, bosom was exposed and her skirts were stripped away. And General Reynol? The queen pressed. His, well, he was, she hesitated. Leonidas was impatient. I could sense his concern with the way things were going in the shortness with Amy. Tell us what happened. His manhood was exposed, she blurted out. What? Exclaimed Leonidas. Amy didn't answer, just blushed furiously and looked at the floor. Before Leonidas could pursue her further, Queen Celie asked a question of the guard near Amy. What did you see? Well, I came when I heard the screaming from my post at the entrance to the private corridors. I guess it was Amy I heard. Anyway, when I got there, her grace's clothes were as Amy described. Both her grace and Amy were struggling with General Reynol, with their hands against his chest as he leaned over them. Now Leonidas asked, and General Reynol's condition? He was, as Amy described, claimed the guard. Queen Celie resumed as questioner. What did you do? I took his arms and tried to pull him off the women. His reaction? This was from Leonidas in a sort of two-sided interrogation. He seemed to sag in my arms as though defeated. When the women had retreated into another room, I let him fasten himself up. By this time, other guards had arrived and we took him into custody. I saw to it that the queen was notified. She told me to find you. It, took a bit longer to find you than I expected, my Lord Regent. Leonidas gave a quick glance to me, a bit of heat showing at his neck, before he asked, Did General Reynol say anything? Well, my lord, it was not very clear, replied the guard. What did he say, man? Leonidas demanded. He was mumbling mostly, but it sounded to me like, stupid bitch. Your pardon, Majesty, the man said stiffly to Queen Celie. As though this were her cue, Queen Celie asked a new question. Amy, was there wine in her grace's room? Yes, Majesty, always. But she hardly ever drank any. Was any drunk tonight? The queen asked. No, Majesty, the bottle was full, replied Amy. This brought a shocked gasp from the entire throne room. That's a lie, Reynol shouted. He had not contradicted the other testimony. Instead, the confused look had become stronger than ever. Instead of replying, Queen Celie merely looked at Hugh, who gestured with his head for a nearby servant to leave. In a few minutes, the servant returned with a bottle of wine in his hands. This is the bottle that was in her grace's room, he announced. It was unopened. That's not right, Reynol shouted. Leonidas, can't you see what they're doing? They put something in the wine to drug me and then made up all the rest. You will have your chance to speak later, Leonidas grimly replied. For now, we are just trying to gather facts. My Lord Regent, Queen Celie said, I think there is one more person whose report we should hear. On that cue, Duchess Amity entered from the same side door that had provided entrance to Amy and the guard. She was wrapped in a long cloak and seemed to have shrunk somehow. It was almost as though she were a young girl, not in her face or hair which were the same, but in her almost painful timidity. Julia left her place by Queen Celie's side and went to Amity. She put her arms around the older woman and helped her to stand in front of the high seats. Tell us what happened, Queen Celie ordered, but her tone was soft and gentle. I have not been sleeping well lately. It was at Christmas so many years ago that Duke Kestrel had taken me as his wife. The memories made my bed seem so lonely that I often slept hardly at all. I suppose I was just too tired tonight, so I admit that I dozed off in my seat in the dining hall. General Reynol took me to my room, and then he. She started to sob. Julia tried to comfort her. I was about to move to her myself, but some instinct prompted me to look at Mother, whose eyes ordered me to remain in my place. Take your time, but you must tell us what happened, Leonidas now said in a surprisingly gentle voice. General Reynol had been trying to get me to accept his advances for some time, Amity claimed. I had not, denied the general. Silence. Leonidas ordered with even greater force. Then, again softly, he said to Amity, go on. I was still sleepy when we got to my room. I turned to thank the general for escorting me when he started to push me back into my room. He reached out, and he grabbed me. Her voice had risen with this last declaration, and she seemed to take power from her own anger, for her voice became stronger, more strident. When I pulled back, he tore my gown. He grabbed my bosom and fondled me. Then he ripped my skirts away. By now she was shouting, but the sharp-edged tones of her voice clattered to a stop like shards from a breaking window, leaving dead silence in their aftermath. Julia was the one who broke the silence. Almost in a whisper, she asked, and then? Her soft voice was answered by an even quieter voice from Amity, only audible because of the absolute silence in the chamber. And then he took his manhood from his pants and tried to force it into me. Tried. Leonidas seized on the key word. Amity only nodded, but her shoulders straightened a little, and she held her head a bit higher. After a moment she continued without further prompting. I held him off as best I could. He promised me that if I screamed he would kill me, but I held him off. When Amy showed up she screamed and tried to help me. I guess her scream brought others. When I could get free of him, I ran to my other room. Amy helped me until we were summoned here. Leonidas had a look of horror in his eyes when he turned again to Reynol. General, now you may explain what happened. It is as I told you. Amity gave me some wine. It must have been drugged. The rest is a pack of lies. Julia released Amity, who was standing stronger now, and started her own interrogation. General Reynol, are you familiar with any drugs that would produce the effects described? Yes. There is one called Canthus Clove that makes you weak and confused, and makes you forget what happened while you were drugged, he replied. Where does one get this, whatever? She asked. It is found in, some places in High Canyon, he replied furtively. Is it generally available in IKEA? Asked Julia. I should hope not. It is a state secret of High Canyon. Then his eyes widened as he realized he had undermined his own excuse. So it is not likely that anyone in IKEA would know of it, Julia concluded. Her response was a sneer from Reynol. Oh, I don't doubt you witches have your own foul equivalent. Julia ignored his comment, at least outwardly, but I could see color in her cheeks that most of the castle denizens had long learned to use as a warning. Her tone was surprising though, seductive rather than sharp, heavy with an unexpected promise. General Reynol, are you a lusty man? What? He replied. Are you a lusty man? Do you enjoy being with women? Julia repeated. Then, before he had a chance to answer, she added, or perhaps you enjoy being with boys? I do not, he shouted. You do not enjoy being with women? Her tone showed more disappointment than surprise. That's not what I said, he yelled in frustration. Ask any of my men. I can handle my women. Do you handle them also roughly? Perhaps that is the only way to get one to accept you. Julia now sneered, all heat banished from her tones to leave frigid disdain. General Reynol, she continued, you ask us to believe that Her Grace invited you into her room, something she never does, and offered you wine, something she never does. You say she drugged you, but you offer no evidence of this, and the only drug that could so conveniently produce the effect you claim is not known in IKEA. Even if it were available, her wine bottle is unopened. For your story to be true, Duchess Amity, Amy, the rest of Her Grace's servants, the guards, perhaps even Her Majesty would have to have conspired together against you, yet you offer no evidence of this, either. Then Julia turned to Leonidas and continued, I think there is a simpler explanation. General Reynol saw that Her Grace was sad and lonely. He believed her to be more than a little drunk and decided to take advantage of her weakness. Instead of being drunk, though, she was just tired. She fought off his advances until help arrived. All the witnesses support this version of the story, the true version. Only General Reynol offers an alternative version, one supported by nothing but his unsubstantiated, hardly unbiased claims. When Leonidas next spoke to the general, he had such a tired tone in his voice that I found myself unconsciously rubbing his shoulder where my hand rested upon it. His own hand rested briefly on mine. Reynol, have you anything further to say? This is all a pack of lies. They have arranged things to look bad for me, but I have done nothing wrong. Leonidas rose from the throne and stepped down to become face-to-face with Reynol, then almost nose-to-nose. You mentioned that your men can attest to your enjoyment of women, Reynol. Leonidas began. I can attest to it as well. I can attest to you enjoying yourself a lot more than the women, especially in places where my father's forces have been victorious in battle. I can attest to your often expressed belief that women are only good for one thing, and I can attest to your disdain for what you consider to be weakness. Leonidas backed up a step or two as though the physical distance were a part of a more important gulf between them. You disgust me, Reynol. I only now realize how much you have always disgusted me. Or perhaps should have disgusted me, for I know to my shame that I sat around the same campfires with you and expressed the same sentiments. Or at least, nodded along with you when you did. Leonidas then looked at Queen Celie. Your Majesty, Reynol was accused of sexual assault. By her own testimony, Her Grace has stated that he was not successful in his attempt, so I find him innocent of this charge. But I find him guilty of assault and of attempted rape and of more things than I even care to think about. In our law these are not capital offenses, and I will not execute him in punishment. You have shown me that retribution is seldom appropriate anyway. However, I will banish him from Achaea and see that my father strips him of all his possessions in High Canyon. These will be forfeit to Duchess Amity. Then Leonidas stepped over to Amity and gently took her chin in his large hand. I had felt that same touch, though with Amity it was not a prelude to a kiss, merely a way to get her to look at him. Perhaps, Your Grace, you can use Reynol's wealth to buy yourself a new dress. Would that I could use it to restore your husband to you. Leonidas turned back to Queen Celie and asked, if this is acceptable to your Majesty? She nodded tightly, then rose. Leonidas never even looked back at Reynol, just left the throne room himself. The pain in his eyes made me want to follow him, but the anger that was there kept him from seeing my offer to go with him. Instead, I heard Mother's quiet tones, Charisse, please come with me. We reached her quarters in the normal few moments, accompanied by Julia, Amity, and Amy the servant. As soon as the door was closed, Mother sighed. A tenseness left Julia as well. Surprisingly, instead of sagging into a seat in a further sign of weakness, Amity stood taller and threw off the cloak covering her. Amy, be a dear and fetch me something to wear, will you? She asked with no sign of her previous timidity. Her dress was torn as reported, but there were no other signs of injury. Mother took her accustomed seat and waved the rest of us to find places of our own. I was so confused that I just stood there inside the door until she spoke to me directly. Sit, Charisse, we have more things to discuss. Many things, I think, I said with dawning comprehension. Julia had relaxed enough for her sense of humor to return. She repeated with ponderous mimicry of Leonidas, Reynol, you disgust me. As well he should, Amity said, showing teeth in a feral grin that transformed her round face into that of a lioness after a particularly satisfying kill. Mother said nothing, or at least nothing with words. Her eyes met mine, though, in gentle challenge. I moved to my usual stool and asked, so, did Queen Giselle send us anything besides this canthus clove? Julia's eyes widened at my conclusion, but it was obvious now that I had a moment to think about it. I assumed that my impulsive red-headed companion had been part of the conspiracy, but had only been told enough for her limited part. Mother just smiled, though the quiet pride in her eyes lifted my heart into my throat almost as much as the kisses I had shared with Leonidas so short a time before. Then she answered, no, not yet. But she is working to send us something, or actually someone, who might be even more helpful. I just lifted an arched brow at her, an invitation to continue. Before she could, Julia interrupted. Wait just a moment. How did you know that Queen Giselle sent the drug? The drug is a state secret in High Canyon, so it must have been someone fairly high up in their nobility. Queen Giselle and Queen Celie are cousins, I replied. The light dawned in Julia's green eyes, revealing a bit of respect as well as her accustomed humor. Mother continued with her interrupted explanation. After Reynol escapes, Kragdal will. Julia interrupted again. Reynol is going to escape? Of course, dear. If he stays here in Achaea until the spring, he may be able to get Leonidas to think about things we don't want him considering. He will have to escape and try to make it back to High Canyon. In the winter? Julia snorted. I didn't say he would make it all the way, Mother said, a cold smile on her face that would have given me nightmares if I had seen it when I was a child. Amity's round face, for all its predatory gleam, could never match that diamond-hard implacability. Amity had plenty of anger, though, regardless of how fiercely her face revealed it. That man killed my husband, or at least he was responsible for it. If it were up to me, I'd do a lot more than lie to get back at him. I hope he freezes alone and forgotten in some nameless mountain pass. And the even greater help? I prompted Mother to return to the topics of our business. Leonidas has a friend of his youth, a man named Elgen, who will be sent by Kragdal at Giselle's urging to assist Leonidas now that Strain and Alrin are dead. They don't know of Reynol's disgrace in High Canyon yet, of course. Giselle's last message says that Elgen will be sent as soon as travel is reasonable early in the spring. Giselle will also insist on accompanying Kragdal when he visits, as he is sure to do once the story of Reynol reaches him. This will delay Kragdal's party until late in the spring or early in the summer. This will give us time to move Elgen to our side. As Leonidas is already on our side, I mused. Not entirely, dear, which is why you had your own part to play tonight. You kept him distracted while our plot against Reynol proceeded. Distracted? Is that what you call it? Julia laughed. I blushed both ways from my neck, though only the part above my bosom showed to them. Still, I knew my own mind had certainly not been considering things beyond the balcony earlier that evening. In the light of what happened, even my inebriated indiscretion that had revealed to Leonidas my maiden's lover fit nicely into Mother's plans. Imagine that. Instead of responding to Julia's good-natured jibe, I looked at Mother. I reached one hand above my head as though grasping at strings, then moved my other hand up and down while lifting on my imaginary strings. For just an instant, pain showed in her eyes, but they cleared when I held my own smile. It was so late it was early when we finally retired to bed. After the trial and the discussions afterward that had no doubt included more groupings than our own, no one rose until mid-morning at least. Part of the reason, or excuse, for that was the lack of sunshine. Our good weather had broken, and while there was no new snow, dark, heavy clouds hung low over Stalwart Guard and its surrounding fields. Even at noon it was still unbearably gloomy. Or perhaps that was just the mood in the castle. I knew I needed to escape it in any event. Taking my hooded cloak and gloves, I went to my high balcony to find it isolated from the world by an icy cloud. And to find it already occupied. My princess, came a quiet voice from the shifting fog. Even the cloud could not disguise the voice, however much it hid the man that produced it. "My Lord Regent," I said, trying to keep any guilt from my voice. "I'm sorry," he said. "For what, my lord?" My voice still stiffly controlled. "For the shame of my countrymen." It was a good thing that he was still standing too far away to see my face, for the shame I felt must have been all too apparent. I couldn't speak. I just leaned against the frigid stones of the ledge and tried to get myself under control. He must have taken my silence, my stiffness, for anger. I sensed as much as heard a sigh, and a settling back against the ledge at his own position. Even in the gloom, his proximity was enough to set my heart racing, to set my mind careening down memories of the feel of his arms around me, of his. It was too much. I turned to escape back down the stairs. A part of me wanted desperately for him to call me back, for him to make things right between us. But they could never be right between us. We were enemies in a war he thought was over. We were incompatible in even more inescapable ways. We were. He said nothing, though. I fled back to my rooms and spent the evening working on my paintings. I even sent for a light supper rather than go to the dining hall. As a result, I missed out on the excitement until finally Mina found me and told me the news. Reynol had indeed escaped. In a surprising display of incompetence, his guards, coincidentally Achaeans, had allowed him to slip out of their grasp while moving him to a cell with better light at the request of Leonidas. Before they could recapture him, he had locked a door behind himself, with them on the wrong side. The near anonymity of High Canyon warriors had provided disguise enough with his features concealed behind the usual hood. The only giveaway had been his selection of his own horse from the stables. The guard at the drawbridge had been reluctant to fire his crossbow on so little justification, and in minutes Reynol was out of sight. The alarm was raised, of course, but the captain of the guards was in his turn reluctant to set out without proper provisions for his men, with a storm so obviously threatening. The threat was realized during the night. When we arose the next morning, we were greeted with snow falling more thickly than the previous day's fog. By evening, the new blanket was near to the belly of a horse and clearly impassable. Mother was proven right once again, for with Reynol's escape the sense of gloom was raised from the castle. Without his constant presence, known even if unseen, the tension between High Canyonite and Achaean had no focus and soon dissipated. Except between Leonidas and myself. I wished 1,000 times I had not chanced upon him during the period before Reynol's escape. Perhaps without that particular focus our own tension could have dissipated. But it did exist. He thought I held him responsible for Reynol's shameful act, yet I knew that it was my own people who were truly to blame for the false accusation. I kept much to myself, or would have. Mother would not allow it. Our winter fair feast had actually been a few days before Christmas, and when the day we celebrated the birth of our Savior arrived, Mother demanded that I take on at least the outward signs of joy and respect for the occasion. She had me dress in a gown much too lively for gloom, gaily festooned with lace and ribbons and bright colors. As so often happens, pretending to be happy brought the reality on its heels. Julia was bubbling with her usual energy. Amity was so much improved in temper that I thought she might give our whole conspiracy away, but Mother's serene confidence dispelled even that fear. By now I had come to love wearing pretty clothes as much as anyone, and my new dress was so beautifully feminine that I couldn't be unhappy when I wore it. The only note of gloom was the absence of Leonidas. With the departure of Reynol, he had become almost isolated. No High Canyon nobles remained. In addition, this was not an occasion his people celebrated, so he did not appear as we laughed and nibbled on traditional pastries. Each of us had small gifts for each other, actually several, for it was our custom to exchange things throughout the day at unexpected times. As the afternoon wore on, though, I stood to leave the table in the dining hall where we had been holding our festivities. "Where are you going, dear?" Mother asked. "I have a, gift to give someone." I tried to smile back, but I'm sure my worry showed. That was clue enough for whom the gift was intended. "It will be fine, Charisse." "Trust yourself," she advised. I merely nodded, but my heart was in my throat as I went to my room to get the gift I had prepared in the long sessions in my chamber. At least, one of them. A few steps that had never seemed so long, and I was down the hallway to another room. The room that seemed to hold only quiet. My knock, though, was responded to immediately. "Who is it?" I swallowed to get my voice to work, then tried as hard as I could to sound casual when I answered, "Your princess." Then my voice went away again as I squeaked when the door was flung open. I hadn't heard a sound of movement to give me warning, but with a magic of his own, Leonidas was standing there before me. I almost dropped the package I carried in favor of using my arms to clutch at him, but I managed to hold it up instead. "Merry Christmas, my prince." Then the package slipped to the floor unheeded as he swept me up into his arms and crushed my lips with a kiss so passionate it was almost painful. But dear God, what sweet, sweet pain. Whatever had passed before had no more meaning than time itself while I was suspended in his arms. I don't know whether it was moments or days before he slowly let my feet return to the floor. Surely my racing heartbeat was no accurate measure of time. But eventually my toes touched the package I had brought, making the wrapping rustle softly. Moving my feet to avoid the package must have seemed to Leonidas like a wiggle of complaint at my so tight bondage within his embrace. He quickly lowered me the rest of the way to the floor and stepped back. "I'm sorry, princess," he said. The good humor that had returned to me with our party carried me past the guilt that had earlier seemed so oppressive, so I teased him rather than retreat into equivalent formality. With a heavy, artificial sigh and a pout that was a deliberate reminder, I said, "So quickly you tire of me, that after only a few times you come to regret kissing me." The twinkle in my eyes must have given me away because he didn't rise to the bait with any defense. Or perhaps he did, because in the next heartbeat his lips were again pressed to mine, and then again, and then again, and then again. His hand was in my hair once more, and I surrendered to the sensuous touch while his breath whispered in my ear, "My Charisse, I only thought you were angry with me." My answer was smothered, but nonetheless clear for all that. As though it were the chaperone my steel prison made unnecessary, the package once again rustled as someone's foot touched it. This time I did wiggle to be let out of his embrace and bent to retrieve the nagging distraction. Leonidas reached for it before I could get my stiffly corseted body into position and held it out to me. "No, my prince, that is for you." "What is it?" "Now I suspect you're smart enough to figure out how to determine that," I laughed. He gave me an artificial little frown before grinning himself. "You know that we of High Canyon do not celebrate your Christmas." "This is not necessary." "It is never necessary, my prince. It is a joy to honor our God with a small reflection of his gift to us of a savior. Accept the gift for the pleasure it gives me, if there is none for yourself." Opening the package, he found first a set of leggings like those I had worn as deacon so long ago. Well, not exactly like, these were quite a bit bigger. In addition, there was a shirt and a tunic and a wide belt. What made them special, though, was their color. The leggings were black, of course. That was traditional. And the shirt was tan in honor of his homeland. But the tunic was richly red, embroidered with black and white and silver and blue as befitted a festive occasion. It was an outfit such as a man of Achaia would wear for a Christmas feast, not the loose tan shirt and trousers of High Canyon. "Would you honor me by wearing these, my prince?" He nodded, then stepped to the chest at the foot of his bed. "Would you honor me by wearing these, my princess?" he said as he handed me a small package, not as big as my fist. In it was a pair of gleaming gold earrings such as a noblewoman of High Canyon might wear. Simple loops, since their styles did not include much ornamentation, yet the rings were smooth and shining with rich depth. I knew of the styles of High Canyon, of course, just as I knew of the styles of Verdantland and of the ancient empire, but I never expected to have the occasion to wear such beautiful treasures. Then the problem of how to wear them came to me. Leonidas, I can't wear these." His face fell as though I had slapped him in the face. "No, my prince, it's not that I don't want to. I can't. These require that I have holes in my ears as High Canyon women do," I explained as I removed the spring clip that was part of my jewelry for the day. "Oh," his face was not much less despairing. "I don't suppose you'd be willing to do that." "Well, maybe," and it was as though I had a string of my own attached to the corners of his lips, pulling it upward. "But I have heard very, unsettling rumors of disease that results from the, punctures." "Not if you do the anointing," he declared. "Anointing?" "Yes. When a noblewoman of High Canyon adopts the rings, her ears are anointed twice a day for 2 weeks with fine wine. It wards off sickness." "Pouring wine on my ears will ward off sickness?" I snorted. "Well, you don't really pour it on, you just sort of dampen your ear with a wine-soaked cloth. But it works. My mother wears the rings, and she had no trouble, nor any other noblewoman that I know." Well, when I brought Leonidas his Achaean outfit, I never expected to be asked to become a High Canyon woman. Part of me wanted to flee from this strange perversion. But I could seldom tell Leonidas no when he was so close to me, with such longing in his deep dark eyes, and on his so warm lips, and I found myself nodding my head. One of the pins I had worked into my hair provided the puncturing tool. Leonidas insisted on purifying it in a candle flame, at least the part that would touch my ears, as part of the ritual. It didn't hurt much, though the immediate application of a few drops of wine stung a bit. The earrings were themselves anointed before he placed them in my ears. They felt quite strange. I couldn't tell if it was because of the weight, they were quite heavy, or because of some magical aspect of the ritual. I found myself tilting my head from side to side to feel the tug on my ears. The motion caught a reflection from one of the candles that flashed at me from the small looking glass near Leonidas' bed. "They are beautiful," I cried happily. "They are nothing beside your own beauty," my prince answered. That earned him a chance to examine them from closer range. Very close range. I flung my arms around his neck and started kissing him like a barroom strumpet, but I had never received such a personal gift in my life. No one could take these away from me. They were now part of my very body. "Now, my prince, you need to wear your new gifts," I demanded. "Some time later." "Very well, my Charisse. Will you wait for me in your chambers?" "Maybe I should just wait here," I suggested with that smile I had learned from Mother. The one that could heat the castle. I swear, he hunched over just a little. I had a feeling I had all too good an idea of what pain had caused his grimace. It embarrassed me with the recognition that I had once again lost track of who I really was. I was going to have to talk to Mother about reducing the compulsion of her persona. Someday. But for that day I just grinned at him and turned away in a swirl of delicate lace. When I returned to the dining hall, Leonidas accompanied me. At our entrance a wave of silence flowed out over the room as people recognized Leonidas in his new attire. Then murmuring flowed in behind it like a reflected wave. I never knew who it was that started the applause, though I suspected that Hugh of Sandar's had something to do with it. Still, once started it grew until there were cheering children and beaming adults in all corners of the large hall. I saw a flush flow up from Leonidas' neck, but he nodded with good grace and escorted me to my seat. "That looks very good on you, my Lord Regent," Mother said. "Thank you, Majesty. It is surprisingly comfortable." I can see why men of Achaea like the style. They like the style because the women of Achaea like the style, Julia laughed. "You have good-looking legs, my Lord Regent." That brought a new flush to his neck, along with a rueful grin, but the agreement that followed on the heels of Julia's pronouncement covered any protest he might make. I was laughing along with the others when Julia noticed my own new gifts. "Charisse, what have you done?" Now it was my turn to blush, a good thing because I was doing about as good a job of it as I could, my turn or not. In our tradition, Leonidas may have claimed me by kissing me in public, but marking me as his with rings inserted into my ears was hardly a matter of tradition. It was a clear statement. Mother looked at me as well, but she said nothing. I could see concern in her eyes, though not anger. Well, sometimes you just have to make decisions by yourself, based on what seems right at the time. I was prepared to defend myself to her if need be. Though perhaps I should say I was prepared to answer to her if need be because I wasn't entirely sure why I had allowed Leonidas to put his rings in me, so how could I defend myself? Julia was not angry either. Once again I saw hurt and disappointment and confusion in her eyes. I would have changed them all for pure anger that might burn clean rather than see her pain. She left the table to flee to her own rooms. Mother moved to follow her, but this time I held her arm to make her stay in her position. With a brief glance of reassurance to Leonidas, I went after Julia myself. Instead of going directly to her room, though, I went by my own quarters first. I had made a special present for her as well and hoped it would act to bridge the gulf that had suddenly opened between us. But when I knocked on her door, I received no answer. "Julia, please let me in," I called. "Go away." For the first time in many months, I used a voice that was not full of music and light energy. I spoke as Deacon. "Julia, let me in." I heard the bolt withdraw, though without voice to confirm the invitation. Nonetheless, I opened the door and moved into the room. She was standing on the far side of her room, looking out the window. It was a struggle to maintain my voice, but I spoke again as Deacon. "Julia, will you give me a chance to explain?" She just stood at her window, looking out into the darkness. Taking her continued silence for as much consent as I was going to get, I let my voice relax into its now normal tones. "Julia, I'm sorry. When I am with Leonidas, I can refuse him almost nothing. If I did not wear my maiden's lever, he would have found out my secret, for on the night of Reynol's supposed attack, I allowed him to undress me. Yet, when he is not near me, my thoughts are always and only of you. I swear this to be true, but no, I cannot prove it to you. Will you take this gift from me, if not as proof then at least as evidence of how I feel about you? Why shouldn't he undress you? He owns you. You wear his mark in your flesh." Well, at least she was speaking to me. Sort of. "And I wear your mark in my heart, where no one can see it but me. It is the one that never leaves me, though." "Huh. It leaves you soon enough if Leonidas is around." Then perhaps I should have said that I wear your mark in my soul. For though Leonidas can indeed excite my heart, only you have ever touched my soul. She grunted, but I could see questions in her eyes though they were still mostly turned away. "It is true. In all the time since Tamer died and I saw you in a different way, no other person has ever caused me the discomfort that you see evidence of every time we bathe." I began to move closer to her as I spoke. "No other person has ever been in my dreams when I wake up at night, and every morning. No other person has filled my mind with visions of beauty beyond the fairest flower, beyond the brightest sunrise, beyond the clearest sky. Let me show you how I see you, I pleaded softly, not as a beggar, but as a lover. There, I said it to myself. Would she believe me if I said it to her? The gift I had prepared for her was a painting, a portrait of her. It was almost childishly emotional. Julia was my angel, floating near the sun with widespread wings and a glowing smile that I had worked on forever. Her smile was full of life, of real humor, yet full of warmth and compassion. It was hers, but it was more than hers. It was mine as well, mine to cherish until I captured it in pigments I had had to mix myself. The painting was not sexual. After all, it was an angel. Others might find it nearly blasphemous, but not sexual. Still, the shape under the robes of the angel was hers and just clear enough to reflect an image burned into my memory. It got her attention. She turned fully away from the window and moved over to where I held the painting near the light. How did you do this? I never posed for you. Julia, I remember everything about you. Whenever I am not under the influence of Leonidas, I think only of you. I have memorized every curve of your face, every color, every shadow. Not only the curves of my face, it would seem, she said, but I could see pleasure in her face, hear it in her voice. Not only the curves of your face, I agreed. I set the painting up on her dresser and took her face gently between my hands. Now or never, I decided. I took as deep a breath as my hidden tormentor would allow and said, Julia, I love you. I love you with all my soul and with all of my heart, my own heart, however buried that sometimes seems. You know as well as I do what part one have to play. Please believe me when I tell you it is only a part, not a true reflection of my feelings. Her answer was a slow movement toward me. I moved just as slowly toward her, wanting desperately for the kiss that seemed now possible yet afraid to frighten away the fragile peace within us. It did not escape. The fragility of the peace was transformed into tenderness as her soft, full lips sought out my own. My hand slipped from her cheeks to her flaming halo of hair, even as I felt her own hands come up to caress my golden tresses. I cannot conceive of a more sensual moment than when we shared caresses while we shared kisses. I have never enjoyed a more tender moment than that moment when I told her of my love. Oh, Deacon, what are we to do? She sighed. For the first thing, you better not call me Deacon, I smiled sadly. But I can't tell you how much pleasure it gives me to hear you say my name. Oh, my love, I know it is you under there. Like you reminded me, I see the evidence each time we bathe. Yet, sometimes it seems so hard to watch while you give yourself to Leonidas. She called me love. She doesn't hate me. I was too happy to share the worry she expressed. Oh, don't worry about that. I could not do it without the persona impressed on me by Mother. But when it is in force, I cannot hold back either. It doesn't mean anything unless he's in the room. Did you really undress for him? She giggled, suddenly remembering my earlier claim. Well, I giggled to her, he did most of the work. I was a bit, incapacitated at the time. Then what happened? She asked. I fell. You fell? Where? In his room, I remembered with another sigh. No, dummy, I mean, how did you fall? What happened? I got tangled in all the material of my gown and just tripped. I ended up on my nose with my chemise up around my armpits. Now I was laughing. A lot of things are funny long after they're over. So he saw your maiden's lover? Yes. He was horrified. He accused Achaeans of being more cruel than High Canyon. He's probably right, she snickered. I certainly would have agreed at the end of our trip to North Vale. Don't remind me, I snorted in a most unladylike way. We better get back to the party, I cautioned. Not quite yet, Julia disagreed. I have something for you as well. Her manner suddenly grew somber as she went to a chest and pulled out a package. As she returned to me, she said, I had these made when we returned from North Vale. Afterward, I wasn't sure if you would be interested. She opened up her package to reveal 2 identical hair adornments, combs with delicate pearls arranged in a small circle. She handed me one and took the other for herself. Julia, are you sure about this? I asked, tears forming in my eyes. Yes, my love. Very sure. It was you that seemed distracted. The combs were the symbol of betrothal for Achaean maidens. It was, of course, unique for me to have one. Typically, only the girl wears one in her hair as a sign of her commitment. But I wore the combs and pins of an Achaean princess rather than the coat of arms of a prince, so this would be my appropriate sign of commitment as well. Or maybe not. I'm not sure I should wear this. If Leonidas finds out what it means, he'll be suspicious. Of what? He'll be flattered. Maybe that's what the rings in your ears mean to him already. No. Really? Do you think so? No, but we better look into it, Julia suggested. You're right. I'll have Mina find out. In the meantime, I'll cherish this pin, but neither of us better wear one. Oh, Julia, I'm so happy. I love you. When this is all over, I'll find out a way to show you. I promise. She smiled and held me. The only promise I want is the promise of our love. That you have, now and forever. Or at least, when Leonidas is not in the room, I grinned. That was probably dangerous, but I had to make sure things were settled. You just remember who I am when he's not in the room, she laughed as she poked me in my armored waist. You never know, I might have to play a part too before this is done. She laughed when she said it, but it was to prove all too prophetic. Chapter 18, Silver in the Springtime. Winter in Achaea can be harsh. Even if you have laid in enough supplies to last through the cold times, there is little to do. In the year we were conquered by High Canyon, it was too cold to leave the castle from Christmas until spring. Of course, it was possible to go outside for short periods, sometimes even for a day or two at a time, but to what purpose? At any time a new storm could descend, making travel impossible and life itself a desperate struggle. So excursions from the castle grounds were tentative and short-ranged. The residents of Stalwart Guard turned their attention inward when the world outside was so forbidding. The example set by Leonidas was sufficient justification for the other members of the High Canyon contingent to adopt Achaean styles. Soon, all the warriors from his nation wore tight leggings, a soft tunic, and a tan shirt that was itself much softer than their previous attire. They would often wear a heavy fur cloak when on outside guard duty, and it was soon difficult to tell a guard born in High Canyon from one of Achaea. The changes were not all one-sided, either. I noticed that the swords worn by the Achaean soldiers in the castle were becoming longer as the winter wore on and lighter. When the days were warm enough for drill in the courtyard, I saw our men learning the quick, light-footed style of High Canyon, though their officers still required more discipline than was apparent in the amorphous flow typical of the High Canyon horde. And on this the pendulum swung back the other way, with the warriors of High Canyon finding comfort in a more structured formation, confident that the man on their right or left would stand his ground. They would be guarded in battle even as they guarded their comrades, while still maintaining an aggressive front. The winter sun set early, so on most afternoons Leonidas would find me on our balcony before supper. We would watch the sunset, sometimes not saying a word for long moments, content to be in each other's company. No matter how cold the world outside might be, when I was surrounded by his strong arms, leaning my body up against his, I never felt uncomfortable. Those wonderful silences together did not replace his kisses. Now that I was claimed by him publicly, in our style with his unashamed kiss and in his style with the earrings I wore, he felt it was his right to kiss me whenever we were alone together. And who was I to tell him no? I went to his embrace joyously, eagerly, every time he gave me the opportunity. I suppose it could have been considered demeaning. I had found out through Mina that wearing his earrings was a sign of his claim on me, but carried no corresponding claim on him. It was a signal to other men to keep away from me, but no promise to me at all. Still, I wore them gladly, unashamedly. When he molded his body to mine, when he warmed my lips with his, when he caressed my unbound hair, I was transported to a corner of heaven that knew no shame, no pride, only glorious surrender. He would escort me to supper. There, we were models of decorum. Still, my often disarrayed hair, my cheeks glowing with more than the coolness of the outside air, made it clear what we had shared only moments before. Sunset after sunset. After supper, I would retire to my rooms for quiet studies or painting. I seldom went alone. But it was not Leonidas who came with me. Julia and I would spend evenings together, me with my studies, her with her embroidery. We would share the same sort of companionable silences that spoke so much of the depth of comfort in each other's company. I did several paintings of her that winter. In later years, I would realize they were shallow, actually, with simple love and overly romantic images. I never apologized for the message in my paintings, though, for it was true. One evening, I looked up from my studies and just watched her at her fine work for a long time. She finally noticed my attention and looked up herself. "What are you staring at?" she asked archly. "You," I answered with a grin. "Why?" "Because you are the most gloriously beautiful woman in all of Christendom," I declared. "That's not what Leonidas would say," she giggled. I giggled too, at her compliment and at the irony of it. Then I sobered and asked her a real question. "Do you think what I'm doing is right?" "Of course, if that's what it takes to win back the kingdom," she replied without concern. "But what about us?" I asked. "What about us?" she echoed, then answered. "We are honest with each other and Leonidas is an invader. I don't particularly like the idea of you in his embrace, but I know your heart belongs to me." "Do you really?" "I wish I could prove it to you," I sighed. She laughed. "I think you make a pretty clear statement every time we bathe together." I blushed in embarrassed acknowledgement of the truth of her comment. Then, another sign of commitment came to my mind, and I went to my dresser where I kept the betrothal hair adornment she had given me. "Put this in my hair, will you?" I asked. She took the small circle of pearls from my trembling hand and placed it appropriately. I was ready to return to my desk when she reached into her bag of sewing materials and drew forth the twin to the decoration that was now in my golden tresses. "I keep this one with me," she said softly. Then, she turned so that I might put her own symbol of commitment in her fiery mane. I could not imagine a more beautiful sight than all that glorious hair highlighted by the softly glowing pearls. From that day on, we wore out betrothal pearls every time we were alone together, and we were together most evenings. Perhaps even more than with Leonidas, these companionable silences were merely counterpoint to greater passion. Our kisses were softer than those that captured Leonidas' power, but even sweeter. And even more frequent. There were many nights when she completed little embroidery and I completed little on my paintings, but neither of us complained. As God is my judge, I felt guilty when I was alone, though. Not for what I did, but for the emotions that I felt. If I could have ensured that my dual life would continue forever, I would gladly have given up my kingdom, left my family unavenged, made all of Mother's plans come to naught. I know it was selfish, but for the first time in my life I was liked, respected, even loved by someone of my own age, someone beside Mother. The imposed ruler of our land showed me of his passionate affection nearly every afternoon. The most beautiful woman in the world showed me of hers every evening. I never wanted that winter to end. But God turns the seasons as he wills, and the time came when the days grew longer and warmer. One day when Leonidas and I were inspecting the sunset, the guard at the castle gate announced incoming riders. We moved to the courtyard for a first-hand appraisal of the situation to see a contingent that looked strangely out of place, foreigners where they didn't belong. Warriors of High Canyon. Perhaps 8 or 10 all told, but even in riding they confused their formation too much for an instant count. I tensed at this intrusion, but Leonidas had no qualms. In fact, as the riders clattered in through the gate, he laughed hugely and roared out his challenge. "Who let you out of jail?" The lead rider, still anonymous within his cowled cloak for all I could tell, pulled up and exposed his face. "Who are you to ask? You can't be Leonidas. You're entirely too pretty in those fancy clothes." "Well, now, Elgen, I've always been better looking than you, so that's no reason to forget your sword brother." Actually, Elgen was not bad looking, though of course he was not as handsome as my Leonidas. He was shorter, though still much taller than me. Where Leonidas had richly black hair and deep, dark eyes, this man had a dark blonde shaggy mane that covered his collar. His eyes, when I could see them, were sort of neutral, too. Hazel, but not really light in color. I stood forgotten on the steps to the courtyard as Leonidas splashed through the puddles and almost pulled Elgen off his horse. They clasped arms like the brothers Leonidas had claimed and then turned back to me. When they got closer, Elgen reached out to take my hand. "So this is her," he said, looking at me but speaking to Leonidas. The girl whose hair is finer than the purest gold, whose eyes are bluer than the highest sky, whose— Yes, Leonidas interrupted. This is Her Royal Highness, the Princess Charis. Nice earrings, he finally spoke to me. It provoked an instant's embarrassment, but then I stood proudly and shook my golden hair back to make them stand clear. Yes, they're beautiful, I declared. Elgen was about to say something, but just then Queen Celia arrived with Julia. He dropped my hand like an old rag and flowed to them with the fluid ease that Leonidas demonstrated, though at a much higher energy level. He went to one knee right there in the muddy courtyard, but before Julia, not the queen. It was Julia's hand that he now reached for, and it was at his lips before the warmth of his touch had been forgotten by mine. His words, though, were once again for Leonidas. Sword brother, I am going to have to teach you how to write more clearly. You said her hair was red, but you did not tell me it glowed like molten copper fresh poured from the furnace. You said her eyes were green, but you did not tell me they were brighter than a meadow after a cleansing rain. You said she was pretty, and perhaps here you can be forgiven, for surely the words do not exist to capture such beauty. If I didn't know better, I would have accused you of downplaying your reports on Achaean women so that you could keep them all to yourself. And you, sword brother, returned Leonidas, are still possessed of the most silvered tongue in all of High Canyon. In all of 2 kingdoms now. Leonidas offered his arm to me as we trailed over behind the high energy of our visitor. By the time we were close enough for polite conversation, Elgen was rising from his muddy knee to stare unabashedly into Julia's eyes. Your Majesty, Leonidas began the formal introductions. Allow me to introduce Elgen, my sword brother, and I guess you'd say about a count in your titles. Elgen, this is Her Majesty, Queen Celia, and the Lady Julia you have recognized. May God preserve me if I made a mistake, Elgen laughed, for if there are 2 such beauties as you in Achaea, then I will make a traitor of myself and stay here forever. I wondered if anyone but me noticed the slight start Mother gave at that declaration, and then the moment of cold calculation that followed in her eyes. The arrival of the first party from High Canyon after the long winter gave more than enough excuse for a party. Though I remember being tired near to death after our own muddy journey the previous autumn, Elgen needed only a quick bath and a change of clothes to reappear fresh as the spring flowers that decorated the tables. The shapeless tan garb of our new visitors seemed oddly out of place. Once it would have been impossible, then unavoidable, then merely unnecessary. Now those anonymous outfits were back in our home, a nagging irritation that we were subject peoples to a foreign invader. Not that anyone mentioned any of that. Elgen seemed to say 3 words for anyone from someone else, yet the laughter his stories brought forth made it seem like all were equal partners in the conversation. Well, almost all. Leonidas was as often the butt of Elgen's stories as was Elgen himself, and just as Elgen could laugh at himself with true humor, so too did Leonidas. They conversed over my head with reminiscences that drew on their years together, more years than I had yet been alive. And when Elgen was not talking to Leonidas, he was focused on Julia with an intensity that made me desperately afraid. His smooth talking and ready compliments were a talent I had always envied yet never possessed. I was only too aware of how lonely Julia had been once Tamer had died. How much of her present affection for me was simple loneliness. Queen Celia signaled for the musicians and the party moved to an even more active stage. At least in this I would not need to feel inadequate. Leonidas and I had danced together many times since the time I had run out on him. We had become so accustomed to each other that we could devise wonderfully intricate responses to the music. Yet even here I found myself lacking. Worse, Elgen's bright energy made even Leonidas seem, well, dull. We moved with precision and tempo, he moved with true art. And worst of all, his partner was Julia. She had found a kindred soul in Elgen, all bright enthusiasm, unconcerned about intermittent breaks in the flow as they found each other's rhythms. I was grateful when the musicians turned to slower tunes. That is, until Elgen took Julia into his embrace as shamelessly as Leonidas had once done to me. While Leonidas and I danced quietly together, I asked him, "Did I hear you ask how Elgen came to be out of jail?" "Oh, that was a joke." I always told him if he didn't have me around to keep his impulses under control, he'd end up in jail. Perhaps that would be the right place for him, I murmured under my breath. What did you say, my princess? Leonidas asked. Oh, nothing, I lied, surprised myself at how much truth there was in my feelings about this intruder. Those feelings were not improved when I retired for the evening. Elgen was still recounting tales, each more impossible than the last. Leonidas had long since quit defending himself against these obvious lies, just laughing at the creativity in the storytelling. Julia stayed to listen. I reached my room alone for the first time in many evenings and tried to lose myself in music of my own. Nothing moved me, though, and my studies were no more captivating. In the end, I called for Mina to help me undress and went to bed early, clutching my unworn betrothal pearls in my hand as I worried about so many things. The next morning was a bathing day, and I reached the chamber quite early. Mother was there, already finished with her own morning duties, and helped me from my imprisoning steel embrace. I said nothing, not even in response to the most intimate relief. For once it was not significant next to the ache in my heart. Julia entered gaily a short while later. She bounced and chattered and giggled and sighed and showed all signs of being infected with the personality of our newest invader. For the first time in a long time, I felt guilty watching as she slid into the warm water. Now it was as though I were the intruder. Mother went to the dresser to pick out the day's dresses for us, giving us a short while to soak in the renewing heat. You should have stayed at dinner longer, Julia advised me. Elgen had so many wonderful stories about Leonidas. Stories is right, I grumbled. She didn't even hear me, already launched into a second-hand rendition of one she found especially amusing. Doesn't Elgen dance well? She next asked. Like I cared. He certainly is uninhibited, I offered in feigned agreement. You could do with a little less inhibition, she chuckled. Then why don't you just ask him for his earrings to wear? I cried, turning away. Julia sputtered to a stop, only now picking up on my despair. My love, she said softly, you know there is only you in my life. She slid around the tub to hold me in her arms, but for the first time, I shrugged her away. Oh, Julia, you deserve so much more than me. You deserve someone with the bright happiness of Elgen, not some not-quite man who will always be a disappointment. Do you want Leonidas more than me? She asked. No. Then why should you think that I want anyone else more than you? Had her brains gone astray during the party last night? But you are a beautiful woman. You deserve a strong, handsome man, not a soft weakling. Do you like the kisses of your strong, handsome Leonidas more than mine? She asked. No, again I answered. Then why do you think that I would? Because you're a beautiful woman, I repeated, and I may. The queen has said that when you are with Leonidas, your responses are those of a beautiful woman. Yet you still prefer the sweet tenderness we share. Please believe me when I say that I am the same. She kissed me softly, tenderly, and reminded me, I told you once if I had to choose, I would choose gentle over fierce. I love you, my darling, not Elgen. The strange situation I had found myself in for most of a year had resulted in many inexplicable responses. With the touch of her soft kiss I began to cry, though the tears were not of pain or sadness. Sometimes a woman may sob from relief and joy as soon as from sorrow. I was unaware that Mother had returned sometime during our conversation. When she spoke, her words created yet a further surprise. Julia, it is good that you do not intend to be forsworn, but it may indeed be necessary for you to wear Elgen's earrings. Forsworn? Julia asked tentatively. Oh, child, don't you think that I know you had betrothal pearls made for you both? How often do you think that happens? Amy knew about it before they were delivered. If after all those evenings alone in her room, you had not offered them to Charisse and she accepted, then you would not be so close right now. You knew. Now it was my turn to ask. Of course. And I approve. You will be good for each other, and more importantly, good for the kingdom. I even think you can be happy together, which is an additional positive factor. Then she laughed and continued, if you didn't both wear your maiden's lovers, I would never have permitted you to spend so much time together unchaperoned. Speaking of which, I expect it will be easier for Charisse if you give her a chance to recover from that embrace before she must once again wear her armor. I blushed, but my brave Julia just kissed me once again, and if there were less tenderness than previously, it was replaced with fierce pride I found even more satisfying. Mother chuckled at our response, but then sobered. Actually, Julia, what I said was correct. We need to convince Elgen to support Leonidas in the coming confrontation, not Kragdal. You will need to be a major part of our inducement. Me? She replied. Yes, you, Mother confirmed. He is obviously quite smitten with you. I can understand that, I interrupted with a snicker. And you can show him the value of a key in ways just as Charisse has shown Leonidas, she continued. Now Julia snickered at me. That's not all she's shown him. I rewarded her jab with the expected blush, not that I had any choice in the matter. But in the next instant I pulled one of her slender ankles so that she slid under the water. She came up spluttering but laughing. Mother, though, was not so amused. Girls, pay attention. Julia, you need to arrange in a month or so what has taken Charisse more than half a year with Leonidas. It will not happen if you remain so focused on each other. Charisse, just as Julia must accept the attention that Leonidas gives to you, now you will have to accept the attention that Elgen will be paying to Julia. There can be no more of that sour attitude you showed last night at supper. Can you both play your parts? Yes, Mother. Yes, Majesty, we answered guiltily, but under the water Julia's fingers found their way to mine and twined within them. We completed our bath and dressed for the day in bright colors. The spring air was still cool, but the bright sun made any exposed place too warm for winter clothes, too cheerful for winter colors. It seemed everyone in the castle found an excuse to spend the day outdoors, and the courtyard was still bubbling with activity when I stepped out onto our balcony to wait for Leonidas and watch the sunset. The sunset arrived on time, but Leonidas did not. When the sun was fully down and it was clearly too late for any further hope, I descended from the balcony to the dining hall. Was it my sinful pleasure in the passion of Leonidas' kisses, followed so closely by the sweetness of those from Julia, that now denied me both? My delay at the balcony had caused me to be the last to arrive in the dining hall. Just before I entered, I heard Julia's crystal laughter spill out. My heart lurched once again, and it was with sick certainty that I knew I would find her in Elgen's company. And so it was. My place was vacant at the table, but that didn't seem to bother Julia, nor even Leonidas for that matter. When the servant pulled my chair out, and how often had Leonidas done that instead? I sat quietly. Some instinct made me look up to see Mother's frown, but I just couldn't work up any cheer right then. I trust there were no serious problems that delayed you, Leonidas said. No, I sighed. I only stayed overlong watching the sunset. I was gratified to see a moment of guilt on his face. But before he could reply, Elgen spoke up. Highness, if you are going to arrive late, you should use the accusations for a grand entrance, not slip to your seat like a quiet mouse. I don't believe I have ever been likened to a mouse before, I said stiffly, then found sadness rather than humor in my voice when I tried to make a small joke. Perhaps my cat will stop enjoying my company. The silent too echoed at the end of that statement. Leonidas again looked guilty, and I felt additional sinful pleasure in his discomfort. However, any excuse he might have made was again forestalled by Elgen's quick words. Ah, yes, the infamous cats of the women of your family. Has Leonidas told you of his mother's cat? He was not interested in any answer though, continuing immediately. Her cat is blacker than midnight, and I swear they talk to each other, though not with words. Julia inserted herself into his stream of chatter. Her cat is more gray than black, but they do seem to have a closeness. Of course, she spoils it rotten. Elgen looked at Julia with a grin that I found infuriating, and, what do you spoil, milady? A girl has to have some secrets, she grinned in return, but you need not worry. It is not possible for me to spoil you. And why not? He replied, though in his tone he made it clear he was knowingly giving her the opportunity her comment implied. Why? Because it has already been done, of course, she giggled. I am not the one dressed like a dandy of this gentle country, Elgen snickered in response. No, you are the one dressed in shapeless, colorless rags, Julia snorted. He protested, but these clothes are quite proper for High Canyon. Julia looked around the dining hall, as though seeing it for the first time. Goodness, I didn't know we were in High Canyon. No, and it appears there is little of High Canyon left in those who have been here for a while, he observed. This brought a growl from Leonidas. Careful, sword brother, you go too far. I decided to try some sort of positive contribution for a change and made a peacemaker's offer. Perhaps, Elgen, if you tried an outfit more like my Lord Regent is wearing, you would find it comfortable, too. Good idea, Queen Seely seconded. I'll have something made for you right away. Now Elgen was in the position of accepting or being rude, so he merely nodded. Then his humor returned as he looked once again to Julia. I must admit, the brighter colors of Achaea are most pleasant to the eye. What colors most suit your fancy? Asked Julia, shamelessly fishing for compliments. Which she received as Elgen answered, I have become partial to bright copper and crystalline emerald green. At least that tart had the grace to blush at his comment. Queen Seely stepped into the silence with a question. Count Elgen, what was the condition of the roads between here and High Canyon? For the most part, in good condition, he answered. I must admit you Achaeans do a good job of building roads. The high passes in the mountains between here and High Canyon are still very difficult. But once you are on the plains, the only problems are with swollen rivers. Then perhaps, my Lord Regent, she continued, now speaking to Leonidas, you would consider beginning the spring inspections. You might remember the case of Samuel the farmer, who stole his neighbor's ram. He has petitioned for release from his servitude on the basis of skills learned over the winter. If he has indeed learned to be a more effective farmer, the evidence will be found on his farm. We should also inspect the irrigation project in that area. With that, Trigger Leonidas launched into an enthusiastic explanation to Elgen of the benefits of restitution over punishment in justice. Elgen relaxed into his seat with a smile, but I saw a look of surprise behind his always laughing eyes. Goodness, Leonidas, it seems more than clothes have changed about you, Elgen said when Leonidas finally ran down. Perhaps, Leonidas answered with a grin of his own. He next launched into stories about the many interesting challenges he had faced during his tenure as regent. His reports were not as glibly entertaining as Elgen's tales, but it was clear that his enthusiasm was honest, not only for the technology we possessed, but also for the intelligence of the people who had developed it. I noticed, though, that he made no mention of Reynol in all his comments. The ex-general was too important a personage to be ignored, so I assumed he had covered that situation with Elgen in private during the day. As the meal was drawing to a close, Elgen slid his chair back and stood up. With your permission, Majesty, I think I will go enjoy the evening air. I am somewhat unused to being indoors after my long journey. The stars are calling to me. Queen Seely nodded, but her eyes flickered toward Julia. She needed no additional direction and was already signaling a servant to withdraw her own chair. You could easily get lost in this old rock pile, she explained. Perhaps you could use some help finding a suitable vantage point. It was a good thing I was leaning a bit forward in my seat, for with the backwards motion of Elgen and Julia, all eyes but mine were looking behind me. They did not then see the tears that filled my eyes as the one who had promised me her heart and accepted mine in return, threw herself at the dashing intruder. I managed to cover up my distress by fiddling with a bit of bread, and by the time they had left the hall I was merely quiet. I felt more than saw Mother's look of concern, but it was Leonidas who next required my attention. My princess, perhaps some of this fresh spring air would be of value to us as well. I nodded without words and let him pull my chair back. My soft hand slipped into his large one as naturally as it had done a dozen times before. Yet I still said nothing. He respected my silence as he escorted me to the balcony I had once considered ours. When I leaned against the surrounding ledge, he moved to stand behind me. You are very quiet this evening, he declared the obvious. I merely nodded, still looking outward. Will you tell me what is bothering you? Asked my tall companion. No, I thought to myself, for that would undo everything. What light could I use in its place? The thought that leaped into my mind full-fleshed carried with it the realization that it was not truly a lie, for it had much too much basis in truth. My voice was barely more than a whisper. I missed you at sunset. Oh, he dismissed the problem, or so he thought. Elgen and I were just catching up on things. That is what I expected, I said, still barely louder than the sigh of wind through the eaves. Then what is the problem? He asked, confusion in his voice. That is the problem, I answered, though I knew it would not reduce his confusion. Actually, I was wrong. He said nothing for a moment, but when he spoke again it was clear he had worked out at least part of what was troubling me. Wrapping his arms around my armored waist, he said with softness of his own, "My princess, do not worry. Though I owe my sword brother my life many times over, time spent with him will not make me lose my enjoyment of sunsets on our balcony. Sometimes, the easiest way to mislead is to accept a statement that is the truth without being the whole truth." I said nothing as I leaned back into his embrace. We watched the stars in companionable silence for a while, still comfortable in each other's company. I should have turned to look at him. If I had done so, I would not have seen the flicker of motion at another balcony, one that had on the occasion held a High Canyon noble and an unfaithful Achaean maiden. One that had witnessed the murder of Ulrin at Dracen's hands. One that this time held Elgen and Julia. They were too far away for us to hear their words, but the pure tones of Julia's laughter carried all too clearly. Each note seemed like a dagger in my heart, but the silence that followed was much, much worse. I could see that they were facing each other. I could see his hand reach out and insinuate itself within her soft waves of dark copper. That was too much, and I gasped at the sight. "What is wrong?" Leonidas asked. His attention, returned from the stars to look at me, followed my gaze to the other balcony. He laughed as he saw Elgen take shameless liberties with Julia's hair. "What is wrong?" he asked again, though this time there was laughter in his question. He turned me to face him without releasing me from the surrounding prison of his arms. "He has his hands in her unbound hair." I hissed in shock. "You mean like this?" Leonidas asked as his own hand worked its way into my golden cape. "It is wrong," I gasped weakly. His response was so soft that I had to lift my face to his in order to hear, for them or for us. The gentle embrace of his arms tightened enough to lift me to my toes, even as his own head bowed lower. The sensual magic his fingers worked whenever they caressed my hair pulled my eyes closed and pulled my perceptions inward to a world that had no space for cares beyond our own balcony. The soft touch of his lips provided a path for all the intense emotions that had been tearing at me since Elgen had arrived, and I poured my heart into our kiss, grasping desperately at the linkage to another in a world that had become incredibly lonely within the space of barely more than a day. It was impossible to feel lonely when his lips were crushing mine. I put my arms around his neck so that I could pull myself even closer to him, molding my curves to his strength. My own fingers danced within the hair that guarded his collar, and I forgot myself for a moment. For the first time, I let my tongue sneak out in an invitation to a more intimate dance that I had previously only shared with Julia. At first I felt him stiffen, then I felt his lips open to my invitation. It seemed he knew this dance. If not the same dance as Julia had taught me, then a cousin close enough to find a compatible theme. I had once thought there could be no touch more sensual than the feel of his hands in my hair, then learned to my joy that his lips were even more captivating. Now, we shared a touch that made all previous togetherness seem as distant as hails across a wide chasm. The whipsaw of emotions that had weighed on my heart had made me more vulnerable than I knew, for the release that poured out through our kiss swept me along into passion that I was not able to control, stealing my breath away as thoroughly as my once tight corset had done. My last thought as I felt darkness closing in on me was a more fervent wish than ever that I could be released from my steel guardian, so that I could press my unbound softness into the more natural hardness that had arisen between us. My next sensations were strangely familiar. I felt strong arms supporting me with a rhythmic pulse as I bounced slightly with each step Leonidas took down the staircase. Since I found my arm still draped around his neck, I added my own hold to the bond between us and whispered in his ear, "Do you want to go back?" He was so surprised at my brazen invitation that he almost dropped me, and I clutched at his neck in real need. Then he laughed and let my feet swing to the steps. "You haven't had that particular problem for a while," he snickered. "Maybe we just needed the starlight," I giggled. "No, I don't think you need anything more than the passion that lives within your soft," and he ran down in embarrassment. Instead of saying any more, he turned to continue down the stairs. I could see the flush gradually recede from his neck. After a moment or two, he asked a question that lit a flame in my cheeks so bright made the very torches of the stairway seem dull. "Where did you learn to kiss like that?" "Like what?" I stammered in a wasted stall. You know what I mean, he gave me no relief. What could I say? I had no reasonable answer. My fiery blush was answer enough that I knew what he was talking about, but revealing my relationship with Julia was just not possible. My panicked mind searched fruitlessly for an answer that would be at once believable and safe, when Leonidas provided one that met those needs, though it did nothing for my embarrassment. Did Julia show you how to do that? I had merely thought my cheeks were aflame before. The unerring accuracy of his guess brought so much heat to my face that I feared my hair would catch fire. It was an answer that allowed no denial, and again I was at a loss for words. I just wondered, he mused gently. In High Canyon, it is rumored that younger maidens often ask those with a little more, experience for, instruction in how to be pleasing to men. It seemed reasonable that Julia might have instructed you. You're not disappointed in me? I asked in surprise. Goodness, no, he laughed. I'm flattered, actually, that you would want to learn more, effective techniques for me. You did learn them for me, didn't you? He asked gently. Oh, Leonidas, there are no other men in my life, nor will there ever be, at least this was the truth. For once. The next morning I arrived early at the stables. Julia came down shortly after I did. We looked at each other, but didn't say anything. Who was most embarrassed? Who had most reason to be embarrassed? She had only done what her duty required of her while I knew that I had lost control completely. I had forgotten her. I had initiated a further intimacy with Leonidas myself, far beyond any excuse from duty. For long moments I had no world beyond the arms and the lips and even the tongue of Leonidas. Surely nothing she did could be worse than that. Since I had betrayed her so badly, I knew that it was up to me to offer an apology, but it was hard to find anything to say that would not make my actions sound shameless and cheap. Yet, for the love and honor she had showed me, I owed her no less. Julia, we interrupted each other. I was about to speak again, but she put a slender finger to my lips and made me wait. My darling, I'm sorry for what happened last night. I did more than duty required of me. I found that the arms of a strong man have an attraction I had forgotten. It was a passing fancy, but I surrendered to it. I kissed him, eagerly, when the opportunity arose. This was not the same as strain. That made me feel cheap. This made me feel, well, wonderful. It is only today that I feel cheap. Please forgive me. My love, I whispered, there is nothing to forgive. I have surrendered many times to those urges, more so than you. Instead, I must beg your forgiveness. Last night when I saw Elgen holding you, I gave myself more fully to Leonidas than before. I kissed him like you have kissed me. How? Oh Julia, I'm so sorry. I let my tongue become part of my kiss. The blush that lit her face seemed most strange to me, for a moment, then an insight that had the ring of truth raised itself in my mind. You did the same, but I said it with a grin, such a weight off my shoulders from my own guilt that no jealousy could pull me down. She nodded, her cheeks as bright as her hair. I embraced her and giggled into her ear with a further whispered revelation. He asked me where I learned to kiss like that. Then he guessed that you had taught me. No, she giggled in her turn. Yes, I confirmed. Apparently the girls of High Canyon give each other lessons in love. He was flattered that I cared enough to learn. Just like a man, to assume that all we do is focused on pleasing them, she snickered. Then she whispered in my ear as we still held each other, so, did you learn anything from Leonidas? My answer was a demonstration. I might not have learned anything new, but even the old knowledge I had gained from Julia was magical and wonderful, and, we heard a soft voice. A masculine voice. It caused us to jump from each other's arms. Hugh of Sandars stood there. His face screwed up into the most interesting combination of amusement and pleasure and concern and embarrassment I had ever seen. Of course, the individual emotions he displayed were not particularly dramatic. I knew the embarrassment on my face, for example, made that on his seem subtle. Still the array as a whole as quite surprising in our staid chamberlain. Highness, milady, it would be a good idea to be more, discreet until Leonidas is gone and your betrothal is announced. You know about that, too? Julia gasped. Who do you think told Amy? He replied archly, then continued. The men of High Canyon will be here shortly. Perhaps you should use the time to remember your risks rather than celebrate your hopes." We both nodded demurely, suitably chastened. It was well that he had interrupted us, for no sooner had we accepted our just scolding than Leonidas and Elgen appeared. I was pleased to see that Elgen wore an outfit in the Achaean style, though not as richly embroidered as the one Leonidas wore. In a few moments we were mounted and clattering through the entryway to stalwart guard. Since there was still a chance for bad weather, the outing was only expected to take a few hours with a break for lunch. Our first stop was the farm where Samuel lived. We found it in surprisingly good shape, considering how close on the heels of winter our inspection was conducted. Samuel now had his own small pond, dammed with an ingenious little floating roller that kept the level quite controlled. At this time in the spring there was a goodly amount of water spilling down the watercourse, but it was clear that as the spring runoff slackened, his floating roller would lower itself to retain a higher portion of the water in his pond. "Your Highness, Lord Regent," Samuel said with a polite nod of his head as he removed his cap. "Good day, Samuel," I smiled in return. He blushed like I had just offered a great compliment, but I saw pride in his face as well. "I see you have your own small lake now," I offered him an opportunity to explain. "Yes, Highness. Harris helped me to build it." "But I thought you were to help Harris," Leonidas challenged the man. "Oh, I did, my lord. We built a roller dam for his pond first. But it was my design, so he helped me build one here, too." "Your design?" Now Elgen interjected a question. "Yes, my lord?" Samuel replied, uncertain as to Elgen's rank in his compromised clothing. An Achaean would have displayed formal coat of arms information on his tunic, yet Elgen's was almost bare. "This is Count Elgen," I answered quickly, then urged him to continue, but his question is a good one. "Did you design this?" "Yes, Highness, over the long winter, I just got to thinking about the shape of the pond that I wanted, and worried that it would vary too much with different rainfall." "Why didn't you just use a spillway?" I asked. "A spillway?" Leonidas interrupted the answer. "Yes, a low spot in the dam that would allow water to flow away if it got too high," I replied, beginning to get irritated at the constant interruptions. "Well, Highness, this little stream has a good flow most of the time, and building the dam wall while the water was flowing would be hard. The stream would always be flowing over the spillway, too, which would lead to erosion at the key point. This way I could build the dam while the water still flowed, and then lower the roller into position. If the ground underneath erodes some, the roller will adjust." "And you worked all that out yourself?" Leonidas demanded with a tone that implied disbelief. "Oh, no, my lord. Harris explained about the flow of the stream and all. But in the long winter, when the ground was too frozen to dig anyway, I thought up how to use the floating roller. We tried it on his pond first, like I said." Samuel stammered a little now, somewhat guiltily. "Actually, my lord, I am not as good as Harris at actual building yet, but I have been able to come up with some ideas on what to build that seem to work well. Harris helps me with the actual construction. Or maybe I should say that I help Harris with the actual construction. In either event, I think it is a good thing our Lord Regent decided not to have you executed after all," I smiled. "You see, Elgen?" Leonidas chortled in self-congratulation. "I told you that restitution is better than punishment." "Indeed. If the common men of Achaea are able to do such diverse things, it is a wonder that we ever conquered them." Julia bristled at that statement, and almost snarled at Elgen. "The people of Achaea have not been conquered, only our army is defeated." I was worried for a moment that she would go further into our most basic secret, that while our army was defeated, we were nonetheless even then in the middle of a plot to recover our kingdom. But before she said any more, Elgen laughed. "Your pardon, milady, it is clear that the fire in the hearts of Achaeans has not been extinguished." Then he leaned over and whispered loudly enough that it was clear he intended us all to hear, "And the fire in your eyes when you are angry is a breathtakingly beautiful window to your heart. See that you don't burn yourself on the flames," she answered, but the smile that had replaced the anger in her eyes made her rejection into an invitation instead. My tension at their blatant flirtation transmitted itself to my horse, and it shifted around nervously for a moment. Julia flashed me a look as angry as she had earlier fired at Elgen, thinking that I had made my mount move deliberately. I tried to let her know with a look that it had been an accident, but Leonidas interrupted yet again with a laugh at my unease and a turn of his own horse back to the roadway. As we rode off, he called over his shoulder, "Samuel, if Harris will agree that you have met the demands of the judgment, you may consider it fulfilled." Samuel nodded and sort of bowed and clutched his cap and looked at the dam and was probably going through yet more signs of pleased nervousness when we lost sight of him around his cottage. "How did you know about a spillway?" Elgen asked me as we rode along. "She knows about all sorts of things like that," Leonidas answered for me, and I felt a pride in his pride that carried a complex undercurrent of shame. I should want Julia's pride in me, not his, but as God is my witness, I wanted his approval. I then had to listen while Leonidas recounted all the stories of the simple things I had recognized in our previous inspection tours. It was soon time for lunch in our little outing, and once again some of the peasant families had offered fresh, hot bread. We added a few things from the provisions we had brought and made a meal beside a gently babbling stream. Blankets had been spread for us to sit on, though to my dismay Julia's had been spread some distance from mine. My dismay was well-founded, for I could not refuse as Leonidas joined me, which left Elgen to escort Julia. They sat together much too closely for propriety, leaving me only a most disquieting combination of silence while they whispered together, punctuated by carols of bright laughter as they shared some joyful notion. "It would almost appear you are jealous of Julia," Leonidas chided me, but I could hear a note of concern in his voice. "No, not at all," I denied, and once again a kernel of truth gave force to my claim. It was not Julia who excited pains of jealousy within me, but Elgen. Leonidas nodded in acceptance of my declaration. It didn't matter, though, because it was soon clear he intended to return my focus to him, regardless of what distraction had drawn it away. His large, strong hand reached out to an errant lock of captured sunshine from my golden tresses and brushed it clear of my face. His fingers didn't stop there, though. They continued their polite motion into much more dangerous territory, a simple assistance transforming into a twining caress that lifted my heart into my throat and caused my breath to hold itself for a long, delicious moment. "My Charisse, you need not be jealous of anyone," he claimed, even as the irresistibly gentle pull of his hand in my hair worked once again to draw my eyes closed. I felt my cheek drift over to compress his thick wrist against my shoulder, trapping his hand in a thrall no more compelling than his hand captured my senses. We were interrupted by the sound of a slap and a quick rustle of skirts. Julia had stood up and was walking toward her horse. "What did I do wrong?" Elgen asked plaintively. "Just because we have begun to get to know each other in private does not give you license to claim me publicly, yet," she yelled back over her shoulder. "Yet," he seized on the word with a laugh. It caused her to break her stride, but the look she threw back over her shoulder failed miserably if her intent was to discourage him. Chapter 20. Who's Whose. Our expedition arrived back at the castle without further incident. We had known from the chamberlain's reports that the new irrigation project was proceeding well, but it was appropriate to show those involved that they had our interest as well as our funding. After a brief visit with much head nodding and humming, we escaped back to our familiar abode. Leonidas helped me from my horse, and we were walking together toward our wing of the castle when I realized I had forgotten a scarf in a bag on my saddle. Elgen had made some excuse about looking after his own tack, and Julia had offered to make sure the stablemen took care of our other belongings. "I must go back," I said with a hardly ladylike grump. The question in his eyes was both invitation and request to explain, so I said briefly, "I left something with my horse." "I'll see you inside." "What is it?" "I'll go get it," he offered gallantly. "No, that's all right. I left a scarf and I know where it is on my saddle. Truly, it will take me less time to fetch it than to explain where I put it." He nodded acquiescence and gave me a quick kiss to send me on my way, a kiss that threatened not to be quick just as soon as his lips began to warm mine. Or perhaps as soon as they began to caress mine, for he found my own lips to be hot and eager for his touch. I was about to remind him of our deeper intimacy from the night before when a servant stumbled upon us. Her giggle as she backed around the corner she had rounded to find us was sufficient distraction to bring Leonidas, at least, back into the mundane world. He lifted his head, which put it out of my reach. My whimper of need was not enough to recapture the mood, and in another instant our embrace was ended as well. "Are you sure you don't want me to accompany you?" he chuckled. I responded dreamily, still not really back in the world of servants and obligations. Then I did rouse and shook myself to recover my senses. I smiled to make sure he knew I was joking, and answered, "My Lord Regent, you can go anywhere you wish in Achaea, but if you accompany me on this errand, neither of us may make it to our balcony to see the sunset." "Would that be so bad?" he grinned. Perhaps, I smiled back, enough heat in my gaze to bring a most gratifying flush to his own neck, but sometimes being bad can be very, very good. Now it was his turn to be incoherent. I used the excuse of his discomfiture to cover my exit, only a light-hearted giggle lingering behind as I moved back toward the stables. I was almost whistling as I made my way back to my horse alone. My saddle was already hung on its rack, and I quickly retrieved the abandoned scarf. I was about to turn back toward the main keep when I heard Julia's silvery giggle carol forth from a nearby stall. The partitions between the stalls were more or less solidly closed, but the wood had warped and shrunk enough that there were places to see through while still providing the illusion of privacy. I put my eye to one of the gaps to see Elgen leaning near, almost looming over Julia, who had her back to the far wall of the stall they were in. Elgen's back was toward me, but I could see from the expression on Julia's face that she didn't feel threatened. Quite the opposite. "So, my Lord Count, did you enjoy your filly today?" He had propped himself with one hand in his lean against the party tie-in, but he used the free one to lightly rub his cheek where Julia had earlier slapped him. "For the most part," he answered, and though I could not see his face, the grin was apparent in his tone. "She is rather slender, but shapely nonetheless," he continued. "Do you prefer a larger filly?" asked Julia, crossing her arms under her bosom in a way that drew attention to her feminine bounty. "No, for a filly, the size is perfect." That damn grin was still in his voice. "What size do you think is right for a horse, then?" "Milady fair, my horse is of a size that would spread you quite wide if you were to try and ride it." I nearly fell where I stood at his crude comment, but Julia did not even have the grace to blush. She laughed instead, with a sort of throatiness to her giggle that made it clear she had picked up on the crudity. "Sir, I am a lady. I ride, side saddle. Lady, I am open-minded. I am willing to experiment." This was just too much. Julia was to flirt with the man, not wallow in filth like a rutting hog. I was just about to move around the edge of the partition and confront them when Julia danced lightly out from under his arm and ran her own fingers through her hair, as though brushing non-existent straw from the copper mass. It certainly called attention to her fiery glory. "My Lord Count, I think you are too forward." Now she played the coquette. "Milady, I think you raise a fire in the blood to match your hair," he replied, moving once again to stand close to her. He ran his hand through her hair, and I saw, as I had so often seen from much closer range, that it had the same effect on Julia that it had on me, to draw her eyes closed as though there were some linkage hidden behind the flowing tresses. In another heartbeat his lips were caressing those soft, full lips that I had once known so well myself. And in barely another instant I could tell that they were sharing a more intimate caress, as well as their mouths opened to allow the dance of tongues. God forgive me for my feelings. I had just moments before been ready to enjoy this same intimacy with Leonidas, yet when I saw Julia share that closeness with Elgen I was insane with jealousy. And, even more damning, I was hot with arousal. If jealousy alone had motivated me, I would have stormed in on them though it cost me my kingdom. But I knew my excitement was more vulgar than even that deadly sin of jealousy, and I could not go forward when I was myself so improper in my emotions. The raging conflicts within me took my breath away, and I was panting with a need for air that made my constricted waist once again more than a mere nuisance. As I struggled to get myself under control, my darling betrothed and the crude man that held her broke their kiss to try and catch their own breath. "Milady Julia, when will you allow me to claim you publicly? If you can kiss me like that, I know that you find me not too objectionable." "Not too objectionable," she murmured, "but too new. I have barely met you." You know that our custom of bestowing earrings is not the same as your betrothal. Wear my earrings as a sign that you are willing to get to know me better, he urged her. And what do the earrings signify about your willingness? She asked. Why, the same thing. They signify that I am willing to get to know you better, claimed the intruder. I have heard they are not the same, that the earrings declare that I will not consider others beside you while no such restriction applies to you. He had at least the refinement to admit this. True, but I promise not to bestow them on any other Achaean maidens. Besides, Charis wears the rings of Leonidas. You are not Leonidas, snorted Julia. And you are not Charis, Elgen replied just as dismissively. This brought a fire to Julia's eyes where Elgen's crudity had sparked only amusement. So I suppose you would prefer the princess to me? Well, he mused, she is the princess. That earned him another slap, resounding in the echoing compartment. He caught her hand on the rebound. Though his strength imprisoned her as fully as manacles from the dungeon, his voice rang out with laughter. Oh, milady Fire, do you think I would prefer that pale and bland weakness to your lively strength? I would not have her even if my sword brother made no claim of his own. This was worse than his crudity. I'd show him pale and weak. I had assassinated Strain without hesitation. Well, without hesitation at the critical moment. I could do the same to this arrogant interloper. Then my anger turned to despair as he pulled Julia by her captured wrists into yet another kiss, one impossibly more passionate than before. By her response, I could see that Julia had no anger of her own at his slur toward me. Or, at least, if there were anger in there, it was buried so deeply that it had no meaning except as one more source of energy to flow between them. He moved his hands around her waist, taking her captored hands with his own so that her arms were pulled back as though she were bound in truth and not just in passion. He bent her back, pulling her arms to force her soft curves to mold themselves to his hard body, but she was far from protesting at this force. Her lips sought his as eagerly as they had ever sought mine, and I remembered that she had said she enjoyed surrendering to a powerful man almost as much as she enjoyed gentleness. It was too much. It would have done me no good to spy on them longer, for my eyes filled with tears. My heart pounded in my breast with panic beyond words, beyond thought except to flee. I ran from the stables, sobbing, saved only by the grace of God from making enough noise to awaken an army, though even that might not have been enough to intrude into their transported world. It is said that God will not provide trials that are more than one can bear, and it must be so, for if I had been forced to explain my panic, I would have been unable. Instead, I reached my rooms without other witness, taking refuge finally in the comfort of Wraith, who waited for me with her usual patience. I swept her up into my arms, my small strength only powerful to one so tiny, and wept until her fur was soaked with my tears. That evening I was the one who missed the sunset observation and dinner as well. So it was not until the next morning when I reached the bathing chamber that I learned the news that confirmed my fears. My dear Charis, you are going to have to learn to accept this, at least for the time being, Mother said as she worked to release me from my steel lover. Oh, it's not so bad anymore, but I do enjoy being let free for at least a little while, I answered. Mother stopped her unlacing. I was not speaking of the maiden's lover. I was speaking of Julia. Julia? I asked, but it was not Mother that answered. Yes, Charis. Julia herself answered as she entered the chamber. And with her entry I saw what others must have thought was the cause of my dismay. Julia now wore earrings of her own or of Elgen's. I closed my eyes for a long moment, not so much in denial as in a need to turn inward for strength in the face of this disaster. When I opened them again, Julia's eyes showed pain that was almost more distressing to me than my own despair. I'm sorry, Julia, I whispered. I don't want to stand between you and your happiness. Please forgive me if I can't find the pleasure in your gift that I owe you for the love that we had. Had, she asked, now more pain than ever. You have accepted Elgen's rings, I stated the obvious, wondering why she was surprised at my releasing her from any claims I might have once imagined. And you wear those of Leonidas. These mean no more to me than yours mean to you, she claimed. And what did my earrings from Leonidas mean to me? Did they require that I not love Julia? That I not dream of a day when the claim they represented would be nullified by the overthrow of our invaders? And if not for me, then why should Julia be less focused on the goal than I was? What do they mean to you? I asked, a tiny bit of hope growing through a crack in the wall of my despair. Julia must have seen the hope in my eyes, for she laughed and wrapped her arms around me. Why, they are pretty baubles meant to adorn a maiden like any other jewelry. I think we'll start a style with these. Before I had a chance to reply, Mother interjected her own comment, and though there was a tone more ominous than frivolous in her voice, it did not really dampen the mood. Yes, Julia, we may do just that. Those women of Ikea who had a part to play in freeing our land deserve some recognition. I think earrings such as you wear will honor both of you for the part you played and make a further statement that we are already claimed by our land. No interloper's baubles can take that away. Yes, Julia and I answered together, catching the fierceness in Queen Celia's tone and making it our own. I know that I should have tried to sustain that fierceness, that sense of purpose in every waking moment, but Julia's bright energy and my overwhelming relief turned my mind to joy often in the next few weeks. She spent most of her time with Elgen, but we managed a few evenings together when one or the other would ask for help in some dainty project of no interest to the men. We didn't get much done on our projects those evenings, but neither of us were worried about that. What we were worried about, more so as the spring progressed, was the coming visit from Kragdal. The critical passes were closer to High Canyon than to Stalwart Guard, so he would be on his way before we knew it was possible. Yet, not too much sooner, for messengers made the trip perhaps once a week. We had some warning then, enough to be ready when Kragdal's entourage reached our gates. He announced himself to our guards, as was their custom, and was admitted immediately. However, it was late in the night, and only our chamberlain represented us, along with Leonidas and Elgen. All other members of the Achaean nobility made use of the excuse of sleep, though Mother and I actually watched from a darkened room as Kragdal accepted the greetings of his regent. Hello, Father. I am glad you were able to make it without another night on the journey. We had to strain our ears to hear the breathless voice of Kragdal, but as before it carried strangely well. Indeed? Your clothes would seem to indicate you were surprised by our arrival. Why are you not wearing proper attire? Why, Father, these clothes are quite practical and more comfortable than those we wear in High Canyon. I think you will like them when you try them. Perhaps more than Achaean metalworking, these will someday benefit High Canyon. Someday, Kragdal sneered. There has been precious little benefit so far. But he dismounted with his words and allowed himself to be led into the keep. His last words were to the chamberlain. I intend to hold a court in the morning. Inform the Achaean nobility that all those who reside in the castle are expected to attend. I thought with those parting words that Mother would allow us to get what sleep we could in the remainder of the night, but she had me follow her back to her rooms where Julia and Duchess Amity already waited. No explanations were offered. Queen Celia just motioned me to my accustomed stool and gathered Grey Shadow in her arms to await whatever was expected. Our wait was not long. In moments there was a knock at our door and Hugh ushered in Queen Giselle of High Canyon. My first impression was that her clothes were a feminine version of the shapeless tan garb of High Canyon men, though in a deep, rich brown almost in another spectrum from the drab tan we had seen before. Then as she moved toward us I realized I could tell that she was slender despite her attire, more robe than dress, that seemed to be so concealing. This contradiction was due to the wonderful softness of the knitted robe she wore, all flowing fullness of sleeve and long skirt. Yet when she moved, the wonderfully soft fabric molded for an instant at a time to her still shapely form, promising more than revealing for a most interesting effect. She was a tall woman, taller than Queen Celia. Yet one could see the resemblance in their features, dominated by the clear blue eyes that I knew were also part of me. Unlike Mother and I, Queen Giselle had richly black hair, shining in the candlelight so brightly it looked streaked with white, inappropriate for her apparent age. That impression of discordant color was false though, for the highlights danced with her motion from place to place in her captive cape of midnight. We all stood and were introduced. She merely nodded until she came to me. So you are the Princess Charisse. From the dispatches written by Leonidas, I would have expected one who was surrounded by a chorus of angels. I blushed at her remark and bowed my head. She lifted it with a gesture reminiscent of Leonidas and smiled at me. Don't worry, girl. I know your true nature and I approve of your masquerade. I am not unaware of the sacrifice you have made to recover your kingdom. The pain that Leonidas will feel when your union is shown to be impossible is merely his sacrifice to achieve a better goal than he might otherwise recognize. Thank you, Majesty, I answered quietly. She nodded once again, abruptly, then turned to Queen Celie. Cousin, has the time come, do you think, to reveal my own share of our secret? Mother nodded, waving her arm in invitation to another seat provided specifically for our visitor. Queen Giselle looked at Hugh, then back to Mother with a question in her eyes, but nodded acceptance and sat down when Mother made no motion to exclude him. I suppose you are wondering why I am willing to help you against my husband. It is because he is my husband in name only. We are joined as a symbol of the alliance with Vidalia, my homeland, and that of your own queen. Kragdal has never shared my bed. Then who is Leonidas' father? I blurted, then dropped my head in shame at my tactless outburst. That is a secret I will retain a while longer. It is enough that Kragdal has acknowledged Leonidas as his heir. Most people think that Kragdal's emaciation is due to the privations of his youth. In fact, it is the result of a disease that he contracted in some brothel or another. The disease has left him unable to father a child. He knew this when we were wed, and a part of my duties was to provide him with an heir. In a surprising bit of tact, or perhaps of willful blindness, Kragdal has never required that I reveal the father. I expect it was self-serving, as are all of Kragdal's actions. If Leonidas knew his true father, he might be moved to ally with that man against Kragdal. Suffice it for now to say that I have been waiting since before you were born for the day when Leonidas, my true son, would be ready to rule. On that day, I will support him over Kragdal without hesitation. I believe that day is nigh, she concluded. Queen Celie asked, what do you know of Kragdal's plans? Not much, replied Giselle. I do know that he intends some sort of confrontation tomorrow at the gathering he has called. Confrontation with whom? That I do not know. With you, certainly, since you are the symbol of Achaea, but it may be that he intends more. What do you think Leonidas will do? Giselle had asked Mother, but Mother turned to me for the answer. I don't know, I admitted. He has changed in many ways since he came to Achaea, and I would like to think he has found something of value here. But whether that value is enough for him to stand against Kragdal depends on the focus of the confrontation. Indeed, Giselle nodded, accepting my judgment. However, we must do something soon, whether the result of Kragdal's plans or our own. He will not allow me to continue to influence Leonidas, and if he finds too much of your influence in him, my son will be recalled to High Canyon. I cannot allow that regardless of the cost. What will you do? I asked quietly. Whatever is necessary to stop Kragdal, she vowed. Even if it means that I must kill him with my bare hands. Duchess Amity offered a caution from her own experience that would not be easy. Even when we drugged Reynol, I could not have overpowered him alone, not enough to kill him. It was all I could do to hold him until Amy arrived. Giselle said nothing. Her determination was clear on her face, but determination in the face of superior force might not be enough. Have you no weapons? I asked. She snorted. Kragdal would never trust me with weapons. His guards are under orders not to allow me access to any. They know where you keep your own, or at least where your men keep theirs, since women of Achaea do not usually arm themselves. Not usually, I mused. Then I remembered at least one weapon that was no longer considered within the Achaean inventory. Julia must have thought of it at the same time, for her head came up and her eyes met mine. She stood and with a nod to Queen Celie went to the array of memorials from royal funerals. There she found the dagger she had once taken from Tamer's body to use in her thwarted attempt to join him in death. Julia walked back to Queen Giselle and handed her the dagger. This was once Tamer's. It is considered buried with him, and no matter how good Kragdal's spies are, they will not know about this. Giselle accepted the dagger, leaving the sheath with Julia. After a moment to check the balance, showing that she knew enough about weapons to make effective use of this one, she made it disappear somewhere inside her billowing sleeves. If Kragdal survives this confrontation of his and remains in power, I will use this on him tomorrow night, she promised. Is there anything more we can do to prepare? Asked Queen Celie, bringing our late-night conspiracy to a close. No one had any further ideas, so we dispersed to get what rest we could in the small portion of night remaining. The next day would be as important to the future of Akia as had been the day I became Churis, and it was a measure of our success that we had been able to bring about such significance within a year of the defeat of our army. Still, our weapons were subtle while Kragdal owned those of brutality and force. Would our guile and influence be enough to counter his arms? Man bites snake. The day of which Queen Giselle had spoken was well nigh indeed. It seemed I had barely removed my dress from the night of their arrival when I was once again dressing for the assembly called by Kragdal. I'm not sure exactly why it seemed appropriate, but I felt compelled to wear once again the rich, blue gown that had defined my first appearance as Churis. Mother smiled in approval as we made our way to the throne room. The summons from Kragdal was for mid-morning, but it suited her purposes for us to be there first and remind him that at least in name we were the hostesses and he was a guest. Queen Celie took her high seat and I took my normal position at her side. We were somewhat surprised to see the women of Kragdal's entourage already in place. He had paid them no attention at all on his arrival, neither seeing to their well-being nor giving instructions for them. Yet Queen Giselle and several unfamiliar women were arrayed along one side of the throne room, attended by servants but no armed men. The next to arrive were Leonidas and Elgen. I could see the tension in Leonidas' face and the set of his shoulders. Elgen was trying to lighten the mood with some typical witticism, but for once he was not succeeding very well. His comments were interrupted in mid-jest by a squeal from among the High Canyon women. "Elgen, my love, why didn't you write?" The speaker, or screamer, was a dusky, slender woman with curly ringlets cascading around her face. I had thought Queen Giselle's hair was black, but the sheen in the curls of this woman made the queen's hair seem dull. Perhaps, though, that impression was enhanced by the shining earrings flashing among the dark curls. When she moved out of the crowd toward Elgen, it was clear that she was a dancer or other artist, for surely the human body, even a woman's body, could not flow so sinuously without long training. And it was easy to see her body. The clothes she wore were obviously intended to highlight, not conceal her form. In most places, the material was so sheer that it made no pretense of modesty, and the few places where vision could not penetrate were called into even sharper focus by that very obscurity. My attention had been so captured by the voice and motion of this dusky woman that I had missed the tension that had appeared in Julia. "Love?" she asked, almost to herself, but loud enough to carry at least to Elgen. He stepped forward to intercept the foreign woman, saying, "Deirdre, I didn't know you'd be with the Queen's party." She flashed brilliant teeth in a wide smile and said, "I thought I'd surprise you, dear one." "You know I like surprises." "Dear one." Now Julia's voice rose into a volume that carried more clearly. The smiling girl caught her words and the sharpness of her tone. Her eyes widened, then tightened as she noticed that Julia wore earrings of her own. Deirdre snuggled her arm under Elgen's and asked, "Who is this henna-haired parrot?" "Henna-haired?" Residents of the castle started looking for cover from the storm behind Julia's words. "And a parrot," the woman snickered. Before Julia could respond, Elgen tried to turn the conversation toward formality by introductions. He turned to Mother and said, "Queen Celie, allow me to present Deirdre, who has come to King Kragdal's court from far-off Katmanistan." Then he turned to me, still taking refuge in formality, "Your Highness, Deirdre of Katmanistan." The storm brewing in Julia's eyes was not diminishing with the delay. If it had been me, I would have been looking for the nearest exit, but Elgen moved on with apparent nonchalance, "And this is the Lady Julia." "Julia, Deirdre." The dark-haired Deirdre swayed up the steps to the dais with a grace as fluid as any Leonidas ever demonstrated, yet without that economy of motion. Instead of a deceptively smooth flow, the various parts of Deirdre's body all moved at once, and all in mutually harmonious ways that seemed unencumbered by skeletal limitations. She managed to turn her back to Julia even as she dipped into a deep, graceful curtsy to the queen. Only then she turned insolently to Julia and me, no offer of honor in her haughty grin. Julia met her gaze with equal strength, but her words were to Elgen, "My Lord Count, would you care to explain this?" "Explain what?" he replied. Give him credit for courage. I wouldn't have pretended innocence with Julia when she was in that mood. Julia didn't answer his question, though the arch of her brow foretold many responses yet to come. She spoke to Deirdre instead. I see you wear earrings of promise. Yes, Deirdre replied. I received them from Elgen. As did I, Julia said quietly, the calm before the lightning struck. Then Julia looked again at Elgen. My lord Count, I had your promise that no other woman would wear your rings. Well, actually, he stammered. I only said no other Achaean maiden would. Deirdre now interrupted him, a bit of anger building in her tone as well. So, if I am not around, you lay claim to any woman who happens to be convenient? The storm started to break as Julia's voice rose. I am hardly a convenience. Stiff as you are, Deirdre sneered. I can understand why a man would not find you convenient. Julia's response was back to Elgen. Tell me, my lord Count, does this harlot spread for your horse? Deirdre's voice prevented Elgen from replying as it rose even further. I am a princess in the house of the great Khan, not a harlot. We are not in the house of the great Khan, harlot. Julia shouted. Elgen tried to intercede. Ladies, please. They both slapped him in such perfect unison that there would only have been one sound, if the sound could have been heard. However, it was drowned out by the thunderclap of the main doors to the throne room hitting their stops as Kragdal made his entrance. His face showed nothing as he moved forward, but the strange emotions flowing through the room were not quite what he might have expected from his arrogant arrival, so obviously intended to remind us of his first visit to the throne room. It was clear to him that there had been some sort of tension in the room rather than meek acceptance of his demand to attend. A dozen warriors flowed behind him in the amorphous style of the High Canyon Horde, so familiar in memory yet still incongruous in our hall. He marched directly to the king's throne and sat casually upon it, with barely a glance toward Queen Seelie. When he spoke, his first words were to Leonidas. It is good to see that peace and harmony have resulted from your tenure as regent, that whispering dry voice sneered. Leonidas was embarrassed and was readying himself to explain, when Kragdal forestalled him by continuing, in truth, peace seems sadly lacking, considering the price that was paid and the promises that were made. His eyes had moved from Leonidas to Queen Seelie as he spoke, and it was clear his comment was really to her. When he spoke again, he spoke directly to the queen. Madam, and his omission of her title was clearly meant as an insult. Do you remember the terms of treaty that spared you? She ignored his question, her silence as strong as on the first time they had met. Kragdal had not intended for her to answer anyway, as he rolled on in his flat, toneless voice. It says that you will not take up arms against High Canyon, nor any of our people in Achaea. Do you remember that? It might be imagined that she nodded stiffly, but imagination would have to be a part of the impression, for the movement was too small for certainty. Kragdal waited long enough for some tension to build, then said, Yet Alrin lies dead. Strain lies dead. How do you justify this? I do not need to justify it, she replied. It was not apparent that she intended further comment, but it was not necessary since Leonidas spoke up. Father, I judged those cases myself. Now Kragdal's glittering black eyes shifted back to Leonidas. Indeed, as you judged other cases. Yes, as you judged the case of General Reynol. Yes, Leonidas replied, head high and no apology in his bearing. Which led to the loss of another High Canyon nobleman, Kragdal accused. Reynol escaped his just sentence, Leonidas declared. His loss was his own fault. Not if he were innocent, Kragdal countered. He was not, affirmed Leonidas. Now that thin, humorless smile appeared on Kragdal's face as he replied, perhaps not. Reynol was many things, but innocent was probably not one of them. Then he raised his voice and waved his hand as he said, even now. From a side door, Reynol emerged, limping toward the dais. A hard, thumping sound could be heard with each step of his right leg. He walked, slowly but deliberately, directly to Leonidas and said, surprised to see me? Leonidas nodded calmly, yes, we thought you had perished in the winter storms. Reynol snarled, his voice as twisted by hate as his curling lips. It would have been better for you if I had. By the time I reached High Canyon, my foot was consumed with the black stench. I walk on wood now, thanks to you. Leonidas showed no remorse as his own voice hardened, thanks to your own foolishness. Your sentence was banishment to the very place toward which you ran. You're stupid as well as perverse. Kragdal interrupted them with a harsh command, enough. I don't care who was to blame for what. That is important to justice only. And while justice is sometimes convenient, I insist on order. Order? Leonidas asked with surprise. With the exception of some transgressions by High Canyon noblemen, we have had order and peace. High Canyon noblemen define order, and we can do without peace if necessary, Kragdal declared. Again I say, I don't care about your notions of justice. 2 noblemen of High Canyon have died, and another is crippled. I will have compensation for that loss. The sneering threat in his voice seemed to draw all the air from the room. All breathing stopped for a long moment as we absorbed the sense of his comment. It was Leonidas who asked the question that affected us all. What compensation? Now the grin on Kragdal's face took on a truly evil cast. I realized it was because for the first time, emotion showed in his eyes and not just on his mouth. His gaze swept the room, enjoying his power, enjoying our fear. When he spoke, his tones almost showed emotion, noticeably more by contrast from before than from real content, but still apparent. Why, I think it would be appropriate for some Achaean noble to match their sacrifice. Hugh of Sandar stepped forward immediately. He had probably been expecting this demand, though I admit I had not. His motion stirred the remaining men of Achaea to step forward as well. I might have thought it was an attack, their motion was so cohesive, but there was no aggression in it, only submission. Kragdal drank in the submission like a heady drug. For him with his ambition it might have served that purpose, but his plans had been made long before he entered the throne room. Hardly suitable. A clerk and a few has-been dirt grubbers? I think not. No, I think someone in the flower of youth, say, and here he paused, letting his gaze sweep once again through the room, before coming to rest on me. The princess would be fair compensation. The air in the throne room again thinned as each person gasped. Or perhaps it was only my own breath that seemed inadequate. No one spoke for a long moment. Even after that moment, the break in the stillness was motion, not words. Leonidas moved to stand directly between Kragdal and me. Then he spoke, quietly but firmly no. Kragdal barely spared him a glance. My decision is made. As is mine, Leonidas replied with equal resolve. Kragdal now looked sharply at him. They stared at each other in a battle of wills that seemed one-sided, yet unproductive. Kragdal's black chips tried to force Leonidas to acquiesce, yet there was no countervailing pressure from Leonidas. Instead, it was as though the energy from Kragdal's gaze slid past Leonidas, leaving him untouched without effect, but without resistance. I don't know how long that confrontation might have lasted, for it was interrupted by a motion from Reynol. At his gesture, the High Canyon warriors accompanying Kragdal began to swirl toward the dais. Without specific command, the castle guards moved forward to meet them. I was gratified to see those guards who had originally come from High Canyon standing shoulder to shoulder with those born in Achaea rather than joining their tan-garbed fellows. The sum of castle guards was more than enough to counter the tan swirl, and it halted at the steps toward the thrones. In later years, I would come to understand what it meant to be a High Canyon sword brother. If we had known at the time, we could have spared Julia the onerous duty, dear God, I hoped she didn't enjoy it, of suffering the attentions of Elgen. For our efforts to sway him to our cause were wasted, his loyalty was never in question. It was dedicated to Leonidas from long before he arrived in Achaea. He, too, took his place in the line backing Leonidas and protecting me. When the movement of armed men had come to a tense, momentary equilibrium, Leonidas let a tight grin form on his face. Father, it appears you should have brought more men. So, Kragdal growled, you would hide behind your guards? Leonidas sighed, sagging for just a moment before lifting his chin with firm resolve. No, Father, I know the codes. Will you not reconcile? His words had a formality that said we were witnessing a ritual far more significant than my own life or death. Well, perhaps not more significant for me, but certainly for High Canyon and therefore Achaea. Kragdal answered in a way that deviated from the formality, though it answered the question clearly enough. Get a weapon, bastard. Leonidas started at this label and quickly looked at his mother. Her own countenance was stricken with a guilty flavor that confirmed Kragdal's epithet. Then, for some reason, Leonidas looked at me. With time, I might have fabricated a surprised expression of my own, but the horror of my threatened doom kept me from thinking beyond myself. When I realized that Leonidas was looking at me, it was too late, and he saw confirmed in my lack of surprise the knowledge that I had known already of his parentage, or at least Kragdal's irrelevance to it. So, it seems that you have revealed an open secret, Leonidas mused, as though it had no importance. Then his voice hardened fast. Lord Kragdal, you should not have revealed that to me, though. Not at this time, not under these circumstances. That was a mistake you will not live long to regret. Kragdal did not respond to this warning, merely walking down from the dais and removing his overcloak. Under it he wore the tan shirt and loose trousers I had once considered so inadequate as armor until Leonidas had shown the greater protection available from speed and dexterity. In his arrogance, Kragdal wore no weapon under his cloak and except head Reynol's when it was offered to him. Leonidas had come to the throne room unarmed as well, but Elgen was quick to offer his own sword to his tall friend. Or actually, give it back as his words revealed. I trust this old sword will still be familiar to you. It is for this reason that we exchanged them, sword brother, Leonidas replied. Then Leonidas did something that surprised me, though its import was quickly clear. He took his sword and stabbed himself in his own left hand, not deeply, but enough to puncture the skin. Next he slid the invisible sharpness of the edge along his left forearm, again, not deeply, but enough to leave a trail of blood. His eyebrow lifted at his opponent in silent question when he finished. Kragdal snorted, then did the same to himself. Perhaps the import was not that clear after all, as Julia whispered frantically in my ear. Why did they do that? To prove the blades were not poisoned, of course. Now be quiet, I hissed back at her, quite rudely I'm afraid. She didn't seem to notice, though. Leonidas saluted Kragdal with the formal little flourish he had used with Drayson, then flowed down the steps with that weightless glide I still didn't quite understand. Once again he hardly seemed to move, yet he was quickly standing before Kragdal. You don't need to do this, Leonidas once again offered peace. Kragdal's response was to begin a shifting, swaying drift that seemed rather pointless until I realized I had been watching his offhand, looking at the still dripping blood rather than his sword. His motions had drawn my eye away from the true threat with a strange compulsion that resonated within me with a distant echo of the white cold mind. As a result of this distraction, I didn't even see his first strike. The tip of his sword licked out with a flicker that seemed more an illusion of light than something possible for real steel. Yet in the afterimage that lingered behind my eyes, I realized he had thrust forward directly for the heart of my Leonidas. Yet, just as with that coiled spring attack that Drayson had once used to such terrible effect, the targeted part of Leonidas was not there when the strike arrived. His riposte was faster than thought, but his only reward was a ringing clang as his blade caught the guard covering Kragdal's hand. I see you have kept up on your practice, Kragdal commented, twirling his offhand fingers in another attempt to distract Leonidas. My prince was silent, but a small smile began to appear on his lips. A hard smile to be sure, one without real humor, but still a smile that showed neither fear nor even worry. Kragdal noted it, and for the second time I saw real emotion play across his tight features. Now, though, the emotion was anger. He abandoned his swirling sway for a series of direct, brutal attacks, still lightning swift, still ineffective. Leonidas was somehow never in the same place as Kragdal's blade, though I had no clue how he managed to avoid it. Then my heart clutched so hard I thought I would die and make the fight moot. For I saw another small spot of blood begin to spread from Leonidas' side. At least one of Kragdal's furious attacks had struck home. You couldn't tell it from his face, though, nor Kragdal's for that matter. The fleshless face of our conqueror tightened again into impassivity, his anger assuaged with blood, at least for the moment. Once again his body and his free arm began a swirling sway reminiscent of the snake that he had always seemed to be. Leonidas was unmoved by this distraction. Literally unmoved for the most part, waiting with infinite patience for yet another attack. As Kragdal drifted from side to side, Leonidas flowed to face him, never seeming to have his weight entirely on either foot, moving silently like the drifting fog his countrymen so resembled in war. Kragdal tried another taunt. Do you defend that blonde witch because she has cast a spell over your feeble mind? That taunt was entirely too close to the truth. There had been several times when I had seen seams in the tapestry of Leonidas' mind and could have insinuated compulsions that would still have effect. Yet I had never done so. I knew that Queen Celie had added a white-cold reinforcement to Leonidas' decision not to attend court sessions, but I had never tried to reach his mind myself. However, the only response Kragdal received from Leonidas was yet another small smile. If I had seen only that smile, I would have been much happier, for it looked supremely confident. Yet I could still see the spreading blot of red on his shirt, now almost the size of my palm. Kragdal struck like a snake once more, but this time it was the snake that was bitten, as a faster-than-vision riposte from Leonidas drew a line along Kragdal's sword arm to match the self-inflicted one on the other side. That seemed to be a trigger for Leonidas to go on the offensive. He thrust again and again, always with that deceptive speed that seemed unhurried, yet completed his stroke before I even knew he was moving. Not every attack reached its target, but small spots of red began to appear on the tan Kragdal wore as some portion of the flurry of motion was successful. It appeared that Kragdal was better on the attack than the defense, for he never managed a riposte that was even close to successful. He soon realized this, and the flow of the duel shifted once again to strikes by Kragdal and counters by Leonidas. Yet, even this was of no avail for the conqueror. Leonidas now had the rhythm of the older man's attacks and managed to draw new lines of red on Kragdal's arm with nearly every engagement. The older man began to show fear at the calm confidence he saw in his opponent. His swaying swirl began to describe larger circles as though trying to escape the arena that contained their fight. At times he would withdraw just too far for an immediate attack and glance around at the people in the chamber, though what he was looking for I could not say. Until he caught Reynol's eyes. I saw the direction of Kragdal's gaze, and then a quick flicker of those black eyes. Leonidas was turned away from Reynol, and my first concern was that Reynol would strike from behind, but though Reynol drew a blade, his motion was away from Leonidas. His motion was toward me. As though we were all trapped in some thick, clear fluid, time seemed to slow while Reynol turned toward me. His arm moved with speed I knew was blindingly fast, yet seemed languid. From the tips of his fingers a dagger flew directly toward my heart. A part of my mind was screaming at me to move out of the way of this so leisurely attack, yet this strange sense of time's flow seemed to hold my own body in its grip even more than Reynol's arm. That instant's impulse to move died before it was born. With my wide skirts and my waist stiffened as always by the corset I wore, I knew I could never avoid the stroke. It seemed inelegant somehow to run from this cowardly attack, and before I had more than started to move I had converted my motion to a proud lifting of my bosom toward my attacker, offering him a clear shot at the target he so desperately desired. The flashing knife struck just below my falsely feminine bounty, and bounced from the woven steel of my hidden tormentor, now my savior. Reynol grabbed a sword from one of the High Canyon escorts and lunged at me, sword extending in a line pointed at my head. He might have succeeded before the last winter, but his wooden leg would not provide the power his attack required, and two of my guardsmen, both of High Canyon in an ironic coincidence, intercepted his approach with their own blades. He managed to turn his thrust into a parry of one counter, but the other lunged home to bring one more death in a battle that had not ended on the day that King Andros died. Nonetheless, the distraction worked to Kragdal's favor. Leonidas could sense that Reynol was moving toward me and had withdrawn to the side to see what he could do without dropping his guard against Kragdal. Perhaps Kragdal had hoped the diversion would so unnerve Leonidas that he might succeed where true skill had failed, but Leonidas was too wary of the tan snake for that. However, the withdrawal my prince had made provided another opportunity for Kragdal. He quickly turned and ran toward Queen Giselle. She had been standing quietly by the side, watching the duel between her husband and her son as though she were unaffected. That disinterest was rudely interrupted when Kragdal grabbed her from her companions and used her as a shield between himself and Leonidas, his sword poised to draw a new mouth below her chin. "Drop your weapon," or your mother dies, Kragdal growled. Father, Leonidas drawled, his tone dripping scorn at the once proud claim. I may not be your son in blood, but I am the one you trained from birth to rule in High Canyon. What was your own first rule, always, when one you love is held hostage? Kragdal didn't answer, but I saw in his eyes the knowledge that it had certainly not been to give in to the demands of the abductor. Leonidas drifted closer in that velvet fog manner of his and ensword his own question. You told me that the only acceptable answer is to kill the hostage yourself. To save others from the same fate, you said. Do you remember? By now Leonidas was close enough that he could thrust into Giselle's heart at any time he chose. Here he paused, as though something new had occurred to him. But I'm not really your son, am I? I don't have to accept your ways as mine. So I don't think I'll kill my own mother. Instead, I think I'll kill you. With that he lunged, but his stroke was well wide of the mark. Clearly it had never been intended to strike home. Yet though Leonidas had obviously missed, Kragdal staggered, then began to slump against the back of his unloved and unloving wife. She stepped out of his suddenly strengthless grasp to move behind Leonidas. It was then I saw the blood on her hand, blood from an obvious source, the pulsing wound in Kragdal's chest where Tamer's dagger sprouted like a shiny weed. The thin, fleshless face of our erstwhile conqueror looked up at his wife in surprise, then horror at the image of triumph to be found on her grim visage. He tried to turn around to find succor in another face, but all those around drew back from his as though afraid the evil that had inhabited him might escape to find another home. It was not to be. He hunched forward around the dagger in his heart and collapsed to the floor, ending his brief empire bereft of power, prestige, or posterity. A new sun rises. I never knew if Kragdal's collapse made any sound, nor whether it triggered sound within the chamber. My own heart was pounding so frantically that the pressure echoed in my ears like constant thunder, drowning out all competition. Yet I needed no sounds to see the blood dripping from my prince. The spot on his side had grown to where my spread fingers would not span it, and his other wounds trailed fingers of bright red down his wrists to his hands. Even as Kragdal's shapeless clothes settled around his lifeless body, I was flying down the steps to my Leonidas. I had a scarf that went immediately to his side, wadded to absorb that wide-spreading stain. My accursed corset prevented me from reaching the hem of my gown, let alone the petticoats beneath, so my next motion was to rip a sleeve from my dress. I tried to bind this around one of his arms, but with little success. My hands were shaking, and my fingers were clumsy, and my eyes were filling, and my breath would not meet my needs though I was gasping in desperate sobs, and a large hand caught my fumbling fingers, and my prince's soft voice said, "Charisse, be at peace. It is all right. But you're bleeding." I cried. "It's all right," he repeated. But this time he silenced me with proof of his health far beyond any words of reassurance. His arms surrounded my narrow waist with strength I remembered from so many gentler occasions, and he lifted me to my toes to meet his descending lips. My own were his for the taking, any time, any place, and I clung to him hungrily. I felt a hardness between us that spoke of his power and his confidence even more convincingly than his kiss, but that sensation faded away in an enveloping darkness that left me only the lifeline of his lips. My panic had once again left me unable to sustain the breath needed when I was swept away by Leonidas' embrace, but once again I surrendered gladly to the loss. Or I would have, except a tight voice interrupted, Queen Giselle's voice. Ahem. Leonidas, Princess Charisse, we need to talk. That voice pulled me back from the so-sweet precipice of oblivion, even as Leonidas lifted his head from mine. With that distraction, Leonidas displayed a thoughtful look for a moment, then let me go from his embrace, though not without a final, possessive squeeze. He bent to the body of Kragdal and withdrew Tamer's dagger. With that same strange solemnity he had displayed at Dracen's death, he wiped the dagger on Kragdal's clothes and then presented it to Queen Giselle. I can't tell you how much it eased my mind when I saw that you had this with you and were ready to use it if I distracted him, Leonidas said. Would you really have killed me to get at him? Asked Giselle, quietly, with more calm than I could have shown. No, but I would not have let him escape, either. I might not have been able to stop him from killing you himself, Leonidas admitted. Giselle's face showed fierce pride as she said, Good. You need that strength to rule. Remember the duty shown by the men of Achaea after they lost the battle, and remember also that High Canyon demands no less of her people. Leonidas just nodded, but I could see, not a settling in his shoulders, more a stiffening as though he had taken a weight upon himself, but not let it diminish him. It reminded me of the feel of the crown of Achaea when I had worn it so long ago. The weight was impossibly heavy, yet strengthening at the same time. No one who has not held that responsibility can ever truly explain it, but I knew in ways deeper than words what Leonidas was feeling. Next, he wiped his own sword in a similar manner. In later years, I would come to understand that this was a sign of an honorable duel, where the blood is left with the loser and the winner's blade is housed clean and unblemished. It was a sign of honor to Queen Giselle to have her dagger ceremoniously cleaned, though she had indeed stabbed from secrecy. Yet Kragdal's treachery had been even greater. Leonidas judged and acquitted her of any wrongdoing with his gesture. His own honor was never in question, and his own blade deserved similar cleansing. This took only moments. When Leonidas turned from his duty, his attention was next focused on the High Canyon men who still wore tan cloaks. Are there any others who would challenge me? His tone was quiet, but firm, with a more regal attitude than he had displayed on the first time we had met. He had matured in his year in Achaea. Now he was confident in his own prowess, both as fighter and as leader, yet he showed none of the sense of arrogance that had so characterized Kragdal. The men, his men now, bowed their heads in incongruous unison as they submitted to his authority. The men from High Canyon who wore Achaean styles had already declared their loyalty, but Leonidas next turned to them and rendered them a flashy salute with his sword. He had no sheath, though so at the end he held his sword out to Elgen and looked once more to his mother. Queen Giselle looked at my mother and requested, "Queen Sealy, would you grant me the favor of an audience with you, Leonidas, and, Princess Charisse?" Queen Sealy nodded, then offered, "Perhaps the palace healers should attend to Prince Leonidas. And Charisse will need another dress. That one seems to have been as involved in the fight as the clothes you wear yourself. Shall we say 1 hour? In my rooms?" The principals nodded, and I found myself escorted by Julia toward my own rooms. It was only as we walked quietly along that my saturated mind absorbed the destruction of my own gown. Where I had not torn it, blood had ruined the beautiful fabric just as thoroughly. It made me sad in a sort of helpless way, as though my life were being overturned once again, perhaps back to its original form. The new prospect did not fill me with the longing it had once commanded. The gown had signified the beginning of my masquerade. What did the destruction of the gown signify? I knew that particular gown would always command a special place in my heart, but we soon found another that suited my coloring. The dresses had all once been mother's, of course, and we were much the same in appearance. Still, it took some little time to complete the change, giving Julia and me time for a discussion on our relationship, one that was as hostage to the new situation as any other. "What will you do now?" she began. "I don't know. Leonidas might still feel he has a claim on Achaea," I replied. Her eyes widened with this consideration that she had overlooked. "What will you do if he refuses to leave?" she gasped. "I don't know that either. Achaea must be free. Else all this will have been for naught." "Oh, Julia, I have murdered a man, and Heir arranged the death of 2 more. How can I let it all be wasted? Would you bring Leonidas down as well?" I could not answer for a long moment, which was answer enough in some respects. Finally, I looked into her shining green eyes and said, "My love, when I am not near Leonidas, my path seems clear. Certainly my love for you is paramount. Yet when he is near, I know I would surrender everything we have worked for with no more reward than the favor of his smile. I do not know what I will do if you will not free Achaea." Those emerald gems, the most beautiful eyes in all the world, held only sympathy as she wrapped her slender arms around my narrow waist. This was not an embrace of passion, though we had shared so many of those. The memory came sweetly to my mind. It was love and support and acceptance and a host of messages made more pure and certain by the very lack of words used to convey them. My faithful Mina, who had entered the room silently some time while we were talking, finally interrupted us with a gentle sound. "Highness, we need to finish your dressing if you are to be on time." With her help and Julia's, I was soon back to my once unimaginable feminine beauty. They escorted me to Queen Celia's chambers, but turned away at the door from the meeting with so limited an invitation. I knocked and was admitted by Mother herself, even her ubiquitous Amy for once excused. "Oh, good, Charisse. I'm glad you're here first. We need to decide what we will do if Leonidas refuses to abdicate his regency." I only nodded, since I had no better idea of what to do than when Julia and I had considered the problem. Queen Celia, though, had an answer. "If he does not abdicate willingly, then you must use the white cold mind on him." "Me?" I gasped in dismay. "Yes, you," she adamantly replied. "Leonidas cares for you, and that will give you the access to his mind it will take to sway it to our ends." "I cannot," I whispered, lowering my head. "You have no choice," Queen Celia replied. "If he determines to maintain power in Achaea, perhaps even taking you for his queen, then we will all be undone. He could not accept the public acknowledgement of his attraction to a man, yet the secret cannot be maintained forever, not from him, not from your husband." Dear God, what a quandary. I knew I had the power to do it. I could turn his mind to my ends so thoroughly that we need never doubt his intentions. Yet the very link that would grant me that power would reflect back into my soul with unending shame at such a betrayal. Once upon a time I had considered it shameful to dress as a woman, to hide behind a woman's skirts from my destruction. The salve of duty had made it barely palatable at the time. Yet now I found the mannerisms of a woman merely ordinary, while the thought of betraying Leonidas made any previous shame seem like the false intensity of a child's emotions over trivialities. Before I could find a way to respond to Mother's declaration, her door once again resounded with a request for entrance. I was still too shocked to move, so Mother opened it herself to admit Leonidas and Queen Giselle. I knew with a part of my awareness that Leonidas was attempting to meet my eyes to convey some message, but I could not look at him. Instead, I took my seat with lowered head, ashamed of even considering a course of action that seemed so unworthy. My form seemed to drift toward my seat with an unconscious grace as the others took their own, my mind too far away even to direct the borrowed motions of my body. Mother nodded to Queen Giselle without words, and the High Canyon monarch began to explain the reason she had asked for the audience. Her words, though, were for Leonidas rather than for Queen Celia or myself. "My son, I had not expected Kragdal to reveal your parentage today, or at least his lack of a place within it. I am sorry for not trusting you with the knowledge, but I suppose I had become so accustomed to the deceit that I was blind to the opportunity that finally came to correct it." There was unusual bitterness in his tones when he replied, "It would appear, though, that you were not so reluctant to tell others." She nodded with acceptance of this additional iniquity, but continued before that could become the focus of discussion. "It seemed necessary. Just as when you were growing up it was necessary to conceal the truth from you so that Kragdal could assume you would not betray him. And so I ended up killing him," Leonidas snorted, unconvinced. "No, actually I ended up killing him," Giselle replied, "and in fact that was my plan. I would have had you believe you were his son, you and all of High Canyon, and did not want his death to be on your conscience. Now that at least some part of the truth has come out, you need to know the rest of it. You need to know who your real father was." "Was?" he interrupted. "Yes, your father is dead. Before I tell you his name, I need to explain something of the circumstances of your parentage. Kragdal was unable to father children due to a disease contracted as a youth. His marriage to me was an alliance of convenience, nothing more. A part of that alliance was an understanding that I would bear him an heir from a sire that would provide a strong, tall son." Now her eyes turned to Queen Celia as she continued, though her words were still for Leonidas. "I met your father at a trade conference attended by Kragdal before he started on his path of conquest. He was a tall man, strong and wide-shouldered. But more, he was a kind man, honorable and modest with women. I wanted these characteristics for you as much as Kragdal wanted size." Then her words became focused on Mother in some way that was not a matter of posture or tone, yet was unmistakable. I used every bit of power at my disposal to convince him to share my bed. Every bit. There was a willingness there, of course. I needed something to build upon in his desire. But that willingness would never have been his master if I had not enhanced it. "What do you mean, enhanced it?" Leonidas demanded. For some reason he had not picked up on the change in Giselle's focus, though it seemed obvious to me. She looked back quickly at her son and answered, "Women have ways to stir men's hearts that are not easy to explain." Now Leonidas looked at me, and his acceptance of the truth of this non-answer from Giselle was written on his face. His acceptance of the truth of Giselle's statement was based on his experience with me, which was wrong both in content, since I had not used the white cold mind on him, and in a more basic way that still needed to be resolved. Clearly, Giselle was explaining that she had used the white cold mind to seduce Leonidas' father, though only Mother, and I recognized her reference. Queen Giselle looked back to Mother, which drew my eyes as well. I was surprised to see Mother sagging a bit in her seat as though a burden had been placed on her. Why was she so distressed? And then it came to me so powerfully that I was lifted from my seat by the impact of the truth. "Andras was your father," I blurted out. "King Andras was my father?" Leonidas repeated in confusion, to receive a nod of confirmation from Giselle. Then another implication struck me, and I quietly added, "as he was my father." At this, Leonidas' face tried to display so many emotions that it failed at any. Yet I didn't need clear portrayals to understand the message, since I knew many of the same were marching across my own face. Surprise, of course, but also embarrassment and shame, and a fair amount of guilt. In my own case, the guilt was many degrees higher than he need feel, but my shame increased even further when I recognized within myself relief as well. Giselle provided a last bit of explanation in order to fill the void hanging in the conversation as we tried to absorb this information. "When I saw you kiss after the duel, I knew that I needed to reveal your true father. You and Charis are siblings, and your love for each other must be transformed from the path you have been following." Now there was an understatement, though the prohibition on siblings becoming intimate was no less stringent than the one of those whose gender matched. Of the second consideration, Leonidas remained ignorant. The first alone, though, was enough to require a major revision to any plans he might have had for his reign. He slumped in his seat with shock, a condition I felt only too compelled to match as I sat once again on my own stool. Our mothers let us consider the situation in silence for a few moments before bringing us back into the world outside our own minds. It was Queen Celie who finally spoke. "Leonidas, what do you think would happen if Achaea and High Canyon were truly to merge?" "What? What do you mean?" he stammered in reply. "Consider your clothes. Consider the way the men from High Canyon who have been here for a while acted today. What would become of High Canyon if our cultures were fully intermingled?" He thought for another few moments within his own mind, but the implications were obvious to me as soon as Mother pointed them out. In a few years, perhaps a generation, High Canyon would no longer exist, he finally stated, slowly as the truth became undeniable. "Is this what you want?" now Queen Giselle asked. "No," he answered instantly, then again after a moment, "no. Our heritage is honorable, and if we lose the strength that we have in favor of the luxuries available from Achaea, then that heritage will be lost. Probably to Katmanistan, possibly to Verdant Land, certainly within that generation I allowed." Queen Giselle nodded. "I think you are wise. It was the need to wait until you developed this wisdom that held my hand from Kragdal's throat all these years since I learned the true nature of his black heart." "Then what is to become of our two nations?" he asked. I answered, recognizing at the last instant that part of my answer lay in the way I could address him. "King Leonidas, would you consider an alliance with Achaea rather than conquest?" He started at my address, but squared his wide shoulders and sat a little straighter as he realized he was going to have to make decisions on his own, not ask for others to take the responsibility. "Yes, an alliance would be a good idea," he smiled. "We could gain access to those aspects of Achaean culture that truly benefited us while retaining our own identities." His acceptance of his new role in High Canyon, a monarch with responsibilities for his whole people, seemed to be an anchor that let him gather in the reins on his out-of-control emotions. And with that control, he could release a bit of humor without surrendering to it. "Perhaps, sister, you might negotiate the alliance until the day comes when you find a king for Achaea?" he asked with a twinkle in his eye I had not seen for a very long time. I smiled in return, though it took all the wiles I had ever learned to maintain the secret that made his statement so incorrect. "My prince, there will never be any man in my life but you. Still, if you are serious about an honorable alliance, that will become a problem for Achaea to solve." He nodded, accepting the distance between us that was appropriate for the new world we found ourselves within. As though that were a sign, Queen Giselle made one more request of him. "Leonidas, my dear, would you allow me some time along with Queen Seloi and the princess?" He nodded politely and let himself out. As he left, his glance caught my eye, promising further converse, but he left with only bows in my direction and that of Queen Seloi. When I turned back to look at Queen Giselle, her eyes were troubled but resolute. "Princess Charisse, I have a great favor to ask of you, one that is unfair and not necessarily in your best interest, but which is vital to Leonidas." I looked attentively, but warily. Already the common cause we had shared against Kragdal was falling before interest focused on our separate nations. Now that it is known that Kragdal was not, in truth, Leonidas' father, there will be those in High Canyon who would dispute the success shown. My own prestige will be degraded as well, of course. If it became known that Leonidas had been attracted to a man, however attired, it might become impossible for him to rule. "I must ask you to continue your masquerade for some time longer, at least until he consolidates his own power. I know this is not just, but for him it is simply necessary. Will you do this?" "For how long?" I asked. "I do not know, exactly, but I think it will be at least until the next winter makes travel difficult. Leonidas will spend the time until then establishing himself with all of his vassals. I will try to get word to you before the winter snows, but I am really asking you to maintain your current appearance until I notify you that it is unnecessary." Why did my heart leap at this request? It was as though a weight had been lifted from my shoulders, not another added. It would mean I would continue to dress in encumbering gowns, no matter how beautiful, and continue to behave in a demure, quiet manner. It would mean that I would be expected to continue my studies and my art rather than learn to handle a sword. It would mean that any annoyance I displayed would be excused as being due to the cycle of women rather than caused by true shortcomings in others. Yet all of these problems seemed like the most wonderful prizes to me, once out of my grasp, then loaned to me for so short a time, and now offered for a time that might stretch out beyond my limits of worry. I could feel a smile on my face even before I attempted to answer the High Canyon Dowager Queen. I merely nodded, and it was not until after I made this commitment that I remembered my betrothed. "Julia," I gasped. Mother's face had betrayed pleasure of her own when I had accepted the request from Queen Giselle, and it did not diminish when this problem was recognized. "Oh, I think we can handle that problem," she assured me. "It will be some time before you are expected to produce an heir of your own. In the meantime, I think you may have to remain chaste, but that is not an insurmountable obstacle." "Not for you," maybe I grumped, but I knew I could survive my steel captor, however much the device sometimes pained me. Queen Giselle was not entirely sure what we were talking about, but it was clear even to her that the problems I had alluded to were within our power to address. She stood and nodded to Mother. "With your permission, cousin, I think I will rest for a while before supper. It has been a trying day." Queen nodded and stood herself. We escorted the High Canyon Queen to the door, but Mother held me back when I moved to follow her out. "Are you truly satisfied with this arrangement?" she asked. I looked into my own heart for a moment before replying, but the answer I found there confirmed what I had already truly known. I liked being Charisse a great deal more than I had ever liked being Deacon. Perhaps someday I would once again choose to be Deacon, but it would be as the man I would become, not the boy that I knew was still inside me. The mental maturity that had come to me in this past year would allow me to function effectively as a princess, but the physical maturity that had been so lacking a year ago was still not to be found in sufficient measure to take on the role of crown prince, let alone king. I nodded and received as a reward one of the few embraces that Mother had been able to truly share since her world had become so harsh in the year before. It was a wonderful feeling, alike yet different from those of Leonidas or even Julia. That very contrast made me treasure it all the more as I made my way to my balcony to watch the sunset. And there I found Leonidas. Neither of us spoke as I walked over to the guarding ledge. For a while we shared the companionable silence that I had come so much to enjoy, but as the mountains began to hide a sliver of the sun, Leonidas moved closer and caressed my hair once more. I leaned into his touch, still feeling the stirrings that had been impressed upon me as a means of survival, but which had become an avenue for such pleasure instead. Yet, even as I felt those stirrings, I felt a new balance within myself. The knowledge that Leonidas was my brother added to the part of me that had always been Deacon and kept me from being consumed by the sensuality of his touch. He must have felt the same, for instead of insinuating his fingers deeper into my waves of gold, he pulled back and just put his arm around my shoulders. Well, sister, we have had a day that I will not soon forget. Nor I. I think you should give up on your silly focus on me, you know. You need to find another man. His tone tried to be light, but failed. No, my prince, I whispered, there will never be another man for me. Yet, with those words I knew that I could use the strange power of my mind to help Leonidas, treating him more gently than others might have been able to do. I looked into his eyes, gathered the strength of will that was my true birthright, and brought him into my mind. The impression I left was one of peace. I added an acceptance of what we had done, pulling away any guilt he might ever feel when the secret came out as it would inevitably do. He would remember the artifice that had sustained my masquerade and recognize that he had not been the only one fooled. Let him blame me, someday, for this greatest of lies, but never himself. In moments I was finished, and I could see the effectiveness of my impression by the stiffness that came into his body. Now, though he did not know why he felt differently, he believed that I had never been as close to him, never as desirable as he might have previously thought. That was a necessary residue from the warning about myself that I had placed in his mind. Yet I was content. He would not be harmed by the revelation of my true nature, except perhaps in political ways that I knew were within his capacity to overcome, given a year to prepare. We stood in silence a while longer until the last sliver of sun disappeared, then turned to descend the stairs together. Supper that evening was interesting. The recent war, both the visible portion fought by the men and the invisible portion fought by the women, had unbalanced the remaining numbers of men and women among the combined nobility of Achaea and High Canyon. There were 2 queens, 2 princesses, a duchess, and betrothed crown princess, Julia, though only a few of us knew that her position had been renewed by the current true monarch, with only Leonidas and Elgen to spread among us. Our chamberlain did as well as he could, placing Leonidas between Queen Celie and I, with Elgen between the other queen and the other princess. The other princess was Deirdre. It was clear as soon as we took our places that she was not going to allow rivals for Elgen's attention. Deirdre clung to him with fierce possessiveness, combining a wary watchfulness with arrogant disdain in expressions I wouldn't have tried to match. Actually, I couldn't have matched them at that time even if my face had possessed the requisite mobility. It was all I could do to keep from laughing out loud at her struggle. Neither Julia nor I were concerned with Elgen any longer, except as an ally to Leonidas that we were all glad to have. Yet we needed to maintain the masquerade at least a while longer. Julia had been seated next to me, so she alternated quiet, hidden giggles with artificial long-distance glares at her nominal rival. The basic mood of the table was lighthearted, for all that there had been yet another death that day. If the poisoned soul of Kragdal watched over us, I hope it twisted in torment to see how little mourning there was for him. The primary topic at the table was the trip back to High Canyon. This would begin in the morning for Leonidas and all our erstwhile invaders except those who had been assimilated into the Achaean guard force. Still, we were not all business. The meal had hardly been concluded when the palace musicians changed once again to festive music. With smiling dignity, Leonidas and Elgen rose together and turned to the 2 queens. Their invitation to dance was politely declined, which offered Leonidas an easy choice and Elgen a difficult one. "My princess," Leonidas smiled to me, "would you dance with me one last time?" Even as I stood showing consent, my words held smiling denial. "No, my prince, I will not agree that this is the last time we shall dance, only that it is the last night we shall dance until your next visit." As he escorted me to the floor, we both looked at Elgen and his dilemma. It would be more proper for him, as a guest, to invite Julia, but it was clear that propriety was not first on Deirdre's mind. I hoped he would invite the dusky foreigner. It would be most interesting to see what Julia would do. For that matter, it would be interesting to see Deirdre dance. She moved with such fluid grace that it would no doubt be memorable. Deirdre solved Elgen's problem for him just as my tall escort and I reached the area cleared for dancing. Even over the music, I heard her overloud refusal of an invitation that had not, in fact, been offered. Elgen, dear, why don't you ask that red-haired person while I watch the dance for a while and learn the motions? If there were some analog for the white cold mind among those from Katmanistan, it would have been a look of death. The expression on Deirdre's face would have been sure death with any magic behind it. Luckily for us, it was only a look, and it bounced off Julia's bright energy with no effect at all. She accepted Elgen's delayed invitation as she had done so often before, and they were soon demonstrating their own interpretation for the music alongside Leonidas and I. My snicker to Leonidas was just loud enough for Elgen and Julia to hear. I wondered how he would get out of that. Actually, Leonidas replied, "You should see Deirdre dance. She is quite expressive." Is that what you call it? I laughed. I could see Elgen's neck redden when Julia whispered something in his ear. I'd have to ask her afterwards what it was. In a time that seemed entirely too brief, we were being escorted back to our seats. I knew it was one of Mother's coincidences that the musicians had not played any of the slower, more intimate pieces while we had danced. I was just as glad, though. An intimate dance with one's brother is not all that interesting. While we who had danced took refreshing sips of our wine, Deirdre rose from her seat uninvited and walked to the musicians. After a brief discussion, she moved to the middle of the dance area and the musicians began to play a different tune. It was unfamiliar to me, not one of Ikea, nor similar to those of High Canyon that I had learned over the long winter. Yet it was obviously familiar to Deirdre. She began to move to the music in a nearly languorous way, eyes closed, motion subdued and slow. However, her motions didn't stay subdued for long. Even from the beginning, it didn't look like she was limited by the bones I knew within myself, let alone a corset. In moments, it didn't look like she was constrained by the pull of the earth, either. She flew. Her leaps and twirls and arching twists were perfectly timed to a tempo that I could not have matched even with the now absurdly simple dance steps that had seemed so graceful only moments before. Yet it was not simple energy, nor even physical strength that she displayed. There was a message in her dance, one of unbridled lust, pure, raw, irresistible. For the first time, someone other than Julia excited an intimate pain within my armored torment, and I didn't even like this woman. Elgen was transfixed. I'm not sure he breathed for the length of Deirdre's dance. Leonidas was little better. I looked away only because my hidden pain became too distracting. Even Julia looked with envy and appreciation on her supposed rival. Finally, the dance came to a close. It was not a subtle closing. With the last notes, Deirdre approached the head table and leaped up onto it, then over it. The final flourish matched her twirling drop into Elgen's lap. One hand so perfectly placed it ended up holding the drink he would surely have dropped. "So, my darling," Deirdre laughed as she wiggled her shapely bottom in Elgen's lap, "I can tell you liked the dance. Can the redhead match it?" Julia just laughed, standing to applaud with the rest of us. It was a good excuse to retire an honorable defeat, but it was good that she had that excuse. If her goal had been the lusty Elgen, complete with his strength and silver-tongued flattery, she was lost. Yet, even as Deirdre received her well-deserved cheers, I felt Julia's hand slip into mine and squeeze it. Mine was just as quick to return the pressure. Deirdre was matchlessly sensual, but I pitied Elgen trying to live with her for a lifetime. Of course, there would be times to come in our life together that Julia would do full justice to her red hair and fiery reputation. It would have been almost sacrilegious to dance after Deirdre's performance. She and her target disappeared shortly after that anyway. Our High Canyon guests, truly guests now, wanted to get a start no later than dawn in the morning, and we said our goodbyes that evening. Queen Giselle came up to Julia and handed her Tamer's dagger. "Thank you for the loan of your memorial gift." I think Tamer would have approved. "I'm sure of it, Majesty," Julia replied. Julia turned to Leonidas for a quick embrace even as Giselle's arms went around Mother. Then Giselle turned to me, and while she held me she whispered, "Thank you for what you've done with Leonidas and what you continue to do. It is foolish to make vain promises of aid to one who has demonstrated great competence already, but you know you have my favor if ever there is need." "Take care of Leonidas," I whispered back. He's still my brother and I do love him. Then there were only Leonidas and I standing there. He was such a tall man. And his eyes were so deep and rich a color. The part of me that was still mother would have liked nothing better than getting lost in those eyes for all that he was, indeed, my brother. His wide spread of arms invited me for an embrace of my own, and I went to them gladly. The passion we had once shared was gone, submerged behind cultural prohibitions layered doubly deep for me and reinforced by the white-cold power for him. Yet none of those prohibitions limited the enjoyment of being held by a strong, loving man. Do you have a maiden in High Canyon who wears your rings, as Elgen did? I teased softly while I leaned my head on his chest. No, there are no women in the world for me, but you, he claimed. Go hunting in Katmanistan, I suggested with a snicker. He pulled me back and pretended to slap me, but his hand ended up once more in my unbound hair. Will you tie this up again, now that I no longer have the power to prohibit you? No, my prince, it is the way you prefer me, and so the way I shall remain. What of your rings? They are a part of me now and will remain as well. His next phrase almost made my knees collapse. For just an instant I thought he had learned of my secret as he used the exact words that had formed my decision to become Charis. Duty can be a hard taskmistress, he said quietly. When it became clear that he was talking of his own duty, to return to his own kingdom, my heart started up again. Yes, my brother, but we were never meant to be. He just nodded. Then he dropped his hands, but offered me an arm to escort me to my rooms. Along the way, he made me promise not to come down to the caravan in the morning. They intended to leave as soon as the first rays of the sun reached the valley floor, and he didn't want me to lose sleep to no purpose. I agreed, of course, but I had no intention of sleeping through the dawn. That dawn found Mother and me once again watching from a balcony as the first sliver of sun appeared in the east. This time, Julia accompanied us, and there was no fog of tan men to disrupt the beauty of the scene. Her copper tresses seemed to make her a match for Mother's and my own as the low, red sun tinted our own golden hair into a darker hue. In Julia's hair, proudly displayed, was a small circle of betrothal pearls, twin to the one in my own blonde mane. Then as the sun rose further and changed from red toward brighter colors, the difference between us became apparent when her own hair held the memory of morning fire while ours matched the lighter tones achieved by the rising sun. I never would have believed that High Canyon would someday leave our land, and without a fight, Julia said quietly. Oh, there was a fight, Queen Siloe claimed, and I knew that she was right. We had fought with every bit of ability God had granted to us, but our weapons were not those of men. Yet the wiles of the women of Achaea were no less effective than the weapons of men. In this case, they had even been more effective. Still, I resolved within myself to pray that we would never again have to use such beautiful weapons as women possessed in such a terrible way. As the sunlight reached the floor of the valley before us, a tall, dark-haired man stepped to our side of the waiting caravan. He lifted his arm in a wave of greeting and of parting. The noble women of Achaea, of whom I was still a part, returned that greeting with waves of our own. Then, our one-time ruler joined his own people to leave us once again free.